Chapter 976. Barty was the representative of the LCRF in this conference. He was the largest of the specters in the current environment. It was quite miraculous that he was able to maintain an extremely low profile. He didn't speak or make an appearance. It was as if he was hidden outside the range of everyone's attention. But when he truly entered the spotlight, he displayed an extremely high level of ability to express himself. He spoke with fervor and assurance. The current situation is that the influence of Luo Nan's show has already been created. If the situation continues to develop, he will soon become an authority in the relevant field. Bald Jeff reminded politely. He already is, Mr. Barty. We can't deliberately underestimate him. There was a sting in these words. In certain circles, there were no secrets. The other participants began to wake up one after another. The fat and strong faction before them had a subtle and bizarre stance. He was once a world-renowned trader. He was a high-ranking representative of the LCRF. However, his most solid identity right now was that of an investment manager under Her Majesty Empress Wu. He had signed a contract and received a salary. Originally, this didn't count for much. Aside from capital, what sort of stance was there to speak of? But right now, that damned peerless stream on the beach was still going on. An enormous dark cloud of deficit was quickly forming and enveloping the top of their heads. At this very moment, Barty's appearance made a lot of sense. Barty completely ignored the peculiar gazes of the others. He continued to speak. But he's far from being a tycoon. He has no foundation in the academic world. He doesn't have any effective economic support. Oh, I know you're talking about the Blood Flame Order and the Castle Financial Group. But the Castle Financial Group is far from entering the core circle of the world. Otherwise, we would probably be shaking hands with Lady Halder right now and discussing grand plans together. Even if there's no lady, there's still the Queen. She's lacked love since she was young. She might have a taste for this. Some people were purely venting their emotions. Their comments were harsh and unoriginal. There were also people who pinched their noses as they discussed. They ridiculed. You want to play the same old trick and create another Luo Yuandao scientific ethics case? A showdown between formatting theory and the archetype format? Come on. Can a crazy old man who only knows how to toss and turn in the wilderness compare to this extraordinary, who is an authority in configuration and soul science? He can't be here to make a fool of himself, right? Whether it was a strange tone or a look of disdain or rejection, none of the poisonous spikes could pierce through Barty's skin. He pretended not to hear anything. He only stared at the bald Jeff. Try, just try. What have we sacrificed? We're not going to recreate the Deep Blue project and carry out that hopeless reverse engineering. It's just for show. Furthermore, did I say that we're going to engage in that kind of internal strife? In our circle, why should we care about the dirty things in academia? We clearly have our own advantages. Advantage. More and more people joined in. At the very least, listening to it wouldn't cause any harm. Facing such a terrible situation, they really needed more comprehensive insights to help them make decisions. His doubts about his position could be put aside for the time being. Barty's bright smile could not be hidden by his thick beard. His body language was also very exaggerated. He rotated his elbows forcefully, moving his forearms and wrists, as if he wanted to stir everyone's brains. That's right, that's our advantage. We're businessmen. We're powerful businessmen. We only need a barely passable product for show. It was a barely passable product. We could launch a similar product in the academic world, in the inner world, and even in the market. We didn't even need to be particularly brilliant. With our influence, we could set off a raging storm. We could completely suppress the influence Luo Nan caused today. What do you think, Dr. Jeff? What was this? The group of ghosts looked at each other in dismay. They thought they were watching a clumsy, low IQ stage play. Baldy Jeff didn't want to answer, but Barty kept staring at him. He could only grin. Mr. Barty, I think it's just for show. Let alone Luo Nan, even the military and government's purchasing agents wouldn't pay any attention to it. You really aren't professional enough in the non-professional field, Jeff. You can't use the eyes of a technician to view the world. Barty's eloquence was torrential. With a wave of his hand, he seized back control. Or perhaps his voice was the loudest. Body language was the most exaggerated? What's our advantage? Is it our strength? No. It's our influence. It's our reputation. It's our system. The high-tech companies and cutting-edge laboratories under our banner represent the correct direction of Earth's scientific research system. The military and government don't just look at a single technology when purchasing or cooperating. In the end, they need a complete system that covers research, development, marketing, after-sales, upgrades, and so on. Because they are a system as well. They have countless hands and mouths in the open and in the dark. All of these must be satisfied and in place. What does Luo Nan have when compared to the system we've launched and endorsed? Is he a technology that might come from an advanced alien civilization? Even if he is, can he digest all of this technology and turn it into cash? It's impossible, sirs. He definitely doesn't have the resources and system we have. The example Jeff gave just now was excellent. A single sand demon is equivalent to an entire supercomputer and a nuclear power plant. Then how many resources and benefits are needed to carry the technology system of this sand demon before it can be turned into cash? Herman watched as Barty easily doubled the volume of an example that he had been using in turn. He wanted to laugh a little, but the two key words at the end of Barty's words immediately pierced his heart. Turn into cash? Benefits? Barty was extremely sharp. He turned his body in an instant and tightly grasped this crucial thread of thought. That's right, Mr. Herman. Everyone, please note that I'm using the extended meaning of turn into cash. For a new technology to be turned into cash, it has to go from the brain to the laboratory to the factory to enter the market to enter thousands of households. Finally, it can be popularized throughout the world. The most crucial element has been completely locked down since the industrial age. That's right. It's benefits. This world has always revolved around benefits, not technology. Or perhaps it could be said that the greatest technology is how to realize benefits. It has always been like this. Those who were good at emphasizing would always gain the upper hand in public. This wasn't determined by the tightness of logic. It was to the extent that some people's rebuttals lacked confidence. But if the technology itself can bring enormous benefits, where is it? Where are the benefits? The military and political systems of the world's 88 mega-cities. The public expenditures of over 100 million people. Where are their benefits reflected? Is it in the brain of a young genius that doesn't belong to the dimension of reality? Or is it in the capital alliance that covers 80% of the world's economic volume? Gentlemen, the truth is that it is impossible for Luo Nan to satisfy the astronomical demand of benefits for an enormous system. And if this process is accompanied by a zero-sum game, it will form a sharp, rippling, and extremely wide-ranging conflict. Uncontrollable conflicts. What would the current rulers choose? Oh, I nearly forgot. Many of you seated here are equivalent to rulers. Is everyone's ultimate goal to take a step further in arming our already victorious armies into superhumans that can fly through the sky and burrow through the earth? Is it to sweep across the continents and oceans, and then trample the solar system? Or is it to have a global reshuffle, to let the new technology drive a new revolution, to let new rulers step onto the stage of history? Don't joke around. The ruling rulers have always thought about a booming market, a high employment rate, an increase in votes, an extension of tenure, asset appreciation, and the expansion of power and stability. This is the mainstream of society. This is the beautiful dream weaved together by billions of ordinary people. In the face of this great trend, a mere one or two new technologies have no foundation, no support, no industry, and no employees. It is as if it fell from the sky. How long would it take to digest it? How long would it take to cultivate it? Who would care about it? Don't be anxious, gentlemen. This world is always changing, but the most essential things are still the ones that govern the operation of society. And we are the manipulators that are adept at using them. This is our advantage, and it is also our essence. For us, this is the best era. We can stand in front of the stage, we can hide behind the scenes, we can be on the left, we can be on the right. As long as we grasp this essential advantage and let it flow into everyone's blood vessels and thoughts, we are the gods of the secular world. What in the world can stump us? The atmosphere in the virtual reality became particularly subtle. It was a bit restless, a bit absent-minded, a bit deep, and a bit awkward. Even though everyone present was a billion-dollar tycoon or a promising future candidate, they were still a bit embarrassed when they were suddenly praised in the face. By the end of Barty's passionate speech, The original theme had long since flown to who knows where, but there was a touch of returning to the natural state. It was exaggerated to the extreme, and it would most likely cause people to reflect. At the very least, Herman was touched and came to a realization. No wonder. He felt that something was wrong just now. It turned out that the two people who spoke the most were. Jeff was imperceptibly selling anxiety. Barty was exaggeratedly pouring chicken soup. The two of them were opposites, and in the end, all they were selling was their butts. Speaking of which, how did Her Majesty Empress Wu manage to stuff this fat-headed, big-eared fellow into this extremely important video conference? Splendid beyond compare. Herman didn't even have time to share this realization with others before someone on the beach of virtual reality loudly exclaimed in admiration. Perhaps it was because of the lingering charm of the previous speech, but the person's description was quite high profile. However, the person who spoke was none other than the true big shot of today's conference. Director Mao. This independent director of Quantum Corporation could be said to have the most right to speak. He could gather everyone's attention the moment he opened his mouth. Next, he raised his glass and indicated to a certain person in the crowd. Today, the most interesting thought I've heard came from Luo Nan. And the most wonderful explanation belongs to none other than you. Herman's eyelids twitched. The person Director Mao raised his glass to was Barty. Inclination. The most crucial inclination. Barty didn't say anything. He didn't explain anything. He just bowed slightly. However, in the eyes of others, at least in Herman's eyes, this sudden diplomatic encounter had clearly drawn swords against each other. Blood was flowing like a river. Chapter 977. In a group environment, people's thoughts should be connected in a certain sense. Aside from thoughts and emotions, there was also the virus. If one was infected, no one would be able to escape. Herman was one of the first to realize this. Then this small insight seemed to form a kind of mental magnetic field. Because of Director Mao's deliberate intensification, the others were infected one after another, giving rise to a similar reaction. Everyone's gazes first focused on Barty and then drifted to Jeff. There was no need to mention the former. Jeff's smiling face never seemed to change. But now they looked at this calm and unruffled face that was neither servile nor overbearing. More and more people let out a long "oh" in their hearts. They actually fell for it. It couldn't be helped. No one would have thought that Deep Blue and Apocalypse Laboratory, who had always been proud and arrogant, would suddenly play this hand. It must be known that Luo Nan had used cage theory to reorganize the mental C model. He had used configuration theory to peel off the skin of Dynamo Core technology. He had stepped on the results of Deep Blue Laboratory to climb to the top, but Deep Blue Laboratory didn't have any particularly extreme reactions. At most, Deep Blue had advanced Dynamo Core technology by 2 generations. The new functions displayed not only proved the deep accumulation of technology, but they also absorbed part of the results of Luo Nan's Blood Intent Ring Fortress, allowing the functionality of the formatting domain to advance a step further. Everyone believed that this kind of high profile would continue forever. The deeper they understood Teacher Li Wei's abilities and background, the easier it was to form this kind of mindset. But today, this mindset was suddenly broken. Was Bald Jeff's behavior his own decision, or did it represent the will of Teacher Li Wei? If it was the latter, what did this mean? What did Director Mao's reaction mean? All sorts of thoughts were like the gurgling soup in a large pot. They transformed into complex tastes that were hard to describe. Of course, the most important point of reference was still Director Mao. Director Mao had always been one of the strongest supporters of Deep Blue and Apocalypse Laboratory. But what was the reasoning behind today's sharp and direct change? Was it an act? Was his heart beating erratically occasionally? Or was this the beginning of an even greater change? Herman subconsciously wanted to contact Wang Yu again. After all, Director Mao's situation was too special. He was the spokesperson of capital, and he was also a peak expert of the inner world. His identities were nearly perfect. Although the Gold Can't Exchange Jean Finga and the recent Her Majesty Empress Wu also had great achievements in the business world, they were not as smooth and natural as him. Even someone like Madame Holder would have to wait. Because of this, he was an iconic figure. Damn, the problem has become even more complicated. Everyone's imagination ran wild, and it was destined that they could not make decisions on behalf of Director Mao, and the situation would not change according to their will. At that moment, Director Mao spoke again and asked Barty, What you said at the end was too vague. Do you have a more practical operation? Barty was like an experienced customer manager, putting on a professional smile. Chairman Mao, which one would you like to operate? I'm very interested in the techniques of the sand demons. Let's work together, Barty replied directly, not bothering to hide anything. What you just said should be competition. To be more precise, it's not a competition. Therefore, our final destination is to let it return to its normal track, to vacate the cage for a bird, to reincarnate in a corpse. If you need skills, just ask him. Barty adeptly used idioms and adeptly entered into persuasion mode. Luo Nan has never experienced hardship since he was young. He doesn't have much sensitivity towards money. What he wants are some superficial things, such as respect, understanding, tranquility. It's the easiest to deal with. We don't even need to connect with him. If we maintain a certain distance, he might even be happy. Someone couldn't help but ask, then how do we talk about cooperation? Just find his secretary, spokesperson, and the like. Find you? Everyone cursed in their hearts. It was unknown whether Barty had received it or not. Director Mao declined to comment. He asked an even more sensitive question. Deep Blue Laboratory and Apocalypse Laboratory. What should we do? This wasn't within the scope of Barty's answer, but he took on the responsibility and responded just as bluntly. Just cooperate. We're all investors and partners. We've been working together happily for so many years. What's wrong with continuing? The group of specters exchanged glances. Quite a few of them were a bit embarrassed. They had similar emotions, but they had different reasons. That's right, all they had to do was cooperate. It was that simple. They couldn't play with a monopoly, but hedging was also excellent. It seemed a bit more practical. Besides, Instructor Li Wei had overseen the Deep Blue world these past few years, presiding over 2 major research projects. He could call the wind and summon the rain, and his words were absolute. He was just like a god. Shouldn't there be some other power to suppress him? Isn't this returning to the original idealized plan? After going around in a big circle, things were back to square one. Most people didn't feel that the torment they experienced on the road was a waste. Instead, they felt that this was a typical spiraling process of understanding. Their self-awareness deepened by another level. This was comfortable. Of course, the most important thing was that someone walked in front of them and took on the sharpest contradiction. Director Mao spoke a few words a second later. Or perhaps it was just an emotional sigh of his own. Life configuration transformation. Configuration transformation into life. Most people knew that this jumped back to Luo Nan's interesting thoughts, but no one could follow up. This was because the vast majority of people couldn't reach the corresponding depth. They didn't have the guts to ask or argue. In the end, Director Mao found Jeff himself. Can we draw on a similar train of thought for the Bloodline Project? Can we conduct such research? A stick poked into the completely unrelated Bloodline Project. Some people were confused, and some people came to a sudden realization. They only heard Director Mao say, "From what I remember, Li Wei mentioned a similar direction, but he didn't say anything else. I suggest that you guys take advantage of the heat and come up with a clear plan. Whether it succeeds or not, everyone can discuss it. Wouldn't that be great?" It was a solid hammer. The dagger was revealed. So it turned out that Director Mao was dissatisfied with the Apocalypse Laboratory's toothpaste squeezing progress? Bald Jeff revealed a smile that lacked sincerity. I don't understand the specifics of the situation. After all. Director Mao interrupted him. I understand. We'll have a good chat with Li Wei. But remember, life may have a certain stubborn tendency, but it doesn't have resources. It's even more impossible to have capital. He glanced at Luo Nan on the beach once more after speaking. Then he disappeared like a bubble and exited from virtual reality. The others weren't so straightforward. Many people looked at Bald Jeff, and some people looked at Barty. No matter which one it was, there were many things that needed to be communicated, discussed, threatened, and cooperated. The conference had come to a conclusion, but it wasn't over yet, right? They had to return to what they were best at, even if it wasn't easy to perform in public. When the number of participants in a conference exceeded a certain limit, it would naturally go to 2 extremes. One was a tedious and boring format. The other was a rambling quarrel. People didn't need to go through a beating in society to have this kind of awareness. To be able to hold a successful conference with an excess number of participants could only prove that the average IQ of the participants was relatively high, or that there was a powerful controller. It would be best if both were present. But in the current conference that Meng Chong was participating in, it seemed that neither was quite enough. Right now, he was in the coastal direction of Zeolite Beach, inside the Aber Manor that belonged to the Blood Flame Order. All of the Blood Flame Order's current higher-ups in D City were gathered here. The core decision-making circle that was already clear back in Xia City. The local power faction of D City that had already been purged once. Even Deputy First Ablatum Yin Lu, who was far away in Ban City, was participating remotely. Of course, the main topic of the conference wasn't to discuss whether or not to send people to assist. There was no value in discussing this at all. Did his order have any capital to say no? When all was said and done, this conference itself shouldn't have happened. However, on Zeolite Beach, Luo Nan had been teaching for a long time, making it hard for people to breathe. The Blood Flame Order didn't even have the chance to go up and express their loyalty. They only had enough time to send people to replenish 10 sets of syncopators in the middle. In addition, there was an entire circle of burners surrounding them. The order was more or less repelled by them. Frankly speaking, in terms of average quality, even if the followers they pulled out were elites, they were still a cut below those burners. The prepared team couldn't be pulled out in a short time, so they would just study. They would listen to Meng Chong's spirit and carry out research and discussion. They would also refer to Luo Nan's live stream of lectures to find and fill in the gaps. The problem was that when everyone gathered together and talked at once, a dispute would ensue. In the end, how would they complete the mission that Mr. Luo Nan had given them? An extremely irritable big fellow? An instinctive desire to destroy everything? A burning feeling of extreme thirst? Admittedly, these descriptions carried more concrete guidance suggestions. There were some configuration references, but in the end, there were no standard answers. Everyone had their own areas of expertise, and everyone had their own opinions. And all of this was followed by Luo Nan's subsequent series of demonstration experiments. Even more new ideas were induced. At the very least, they had to rely on Mr. Luo Nan's train of thought. Then, how should the life solvent belonging to the big fellow be expressed? How should the participants cooperate and combine? The order didn't have a formatting domain. Could they use the Blood Soul Temple to replace it? How should they replace it? Everyone said they were reasonable, and everyone said they were reasonable. No one could convince the other on some key issues. Gradually, the situation went out of control. Speaking of the people from Xia City, there was really no way for them to quarrel. Jiang Yuan was a theorist, yes, but his cultivation wasn't good enough. He could tinker with doctrines, but when it came to cultivation, he was purely there to make up the numbers. Wu Kuei might not even be able to say a single word all year round. Yin Li's environment wasn't suitable. As for Meng Chong, he was still dizzy from Luo Nan's teachings. He hadn't recovered yet. The ones who were truly arguing were the people from T City and the elites of the order, who could enter the battlefield at any time. Their attitudes were actually okay. What they said were all very practical technical problems. However, these problems were produced in a strange and unfriendly environment of a new system. There was no one who could answer them. So when the first problem popped up, a series of problems followed. In the end, it became a mess. It made the organizers and managers of the meeting feel extremely awkward. If there was a powerful person who could control the situation, who could effectively collect questions and immediately give answers, the current situation wouldn't have happened. The problem was that there was no such person. Chapter 978. In the end, Yinla decided to ignore it and went offline with the excuse that she had something to deal with. Under such circumstances, Jiang Yuanjin and Wu Kuei couldn't be counted on. Meng Chong had tried to integrate the two arguments, but to no avail. Thus, he didn't want to waste his efforts and let them argue on their own. He only stared at the live broadcast on the beach, waiting for a suitable opportunity to bring this bunch of disappointing things over. Meng Chong sighed silently. At this moment, he looked at the chaotic formatting domain on the beach, at the format fire that burned from time to time, and at the stupid sand that was becoming more and more like a living creature. His thoughts gradually drifted away. It must be said that he had been a witness to Luonan's format of fire before the others had arrived at Zeolite Beach. But how should he put it? At the time, that special flame had lit up with the deep blue walker as a medium. Meng Chong had even believed that it was a substitute method. But the various abilities that Luonan displayed afterwards gave him an impact that ultimately exceeded the upper limits of what his normal thinking could endure. Not to mention what happened on the beach, that person also had the identity of Mr. M.O. The power he displayed in Ban City was clearly the highest quality of the Blood Flame Order. Why? Talent and genius were no longer enough to explain it. Then, Chong, you also have to say a few words. Don't let these people act too presumptuously. Jiang Yuanjun, who couldn't stand the chaotic situation, came over to his side. Her words were tough, but in fact, she just wanted a moment of peace. Meng Chong forced a smile as a response. Jiang Yuanjun sighed again and chuckled softly. I'm old. It's fine if my legs aren't as nimble as before, but my brain can't keep up either. In the future, we still have to run faster. May the will of the blood flame protect us. The voice suddenly stopped, and the old man was lost in thought. At this time, Meng Chong should have said a few words of comfort, but when the words came to his mouth he said, "It's the same." Both of them fell silent again. In this chaotic debate, the two higher-ups of the Blood Flame Order couldn't see that it wasn't just their own powerlessness. Instead, it was the awkward situation of their order's cultivation theories and doctrines being unable to explain or even settle in front of a truly majestic opponent. The core problem was, should he use the order's blood flame will to forcefully make peace with Mr. Luonan's theory? Or should he use Mr. Luonan's theory to directly explain the blood flame will? In fact, the answer was very clear. How many times had the blood flame will appeared in this round of meetings that made people dizzy from all the noise? The Blood Flame Order was a relatively pure religion. They didn't have any messy beliefs, nor were they so particular. But if the foundation of trust in one's own philosophy was shaken, how could one begin to explain the philosophy? Could it be that the Blood Flame Order was ultimately going to be like a fire of emotions that came and went without a trace in the darkness, silently dissipating on the eve of the arrival of true light? Meng Chong had never felt that he was a particularly devout follower. He had joined the Blood Flame Order with the identity of a security captain, withstood the so-called Blood Flame Will's test, narrowly escaping death many times to reach his current position. The source of his inner strength didn't seem to have much to do with the Blood Flame Will. However, at this stage, he was still a little absent-minded. Especially when Luonan experienced the profoundness of emotions that flowed freely from the beach. He unconsciously muttered to himself, observing the world with the eternal laws. Changing other people's views is not a good way of learning. The old man's ears were very sharp. He could tell that Meng Chong's expression was born out of Spinoza's most famous phrase, seeing things under the eternal laws. The words used to describe the current Luonan seemed passable on the surface, but the core was clearly different. Moreover, using the religious explanation of a devout Christian to make a judgment on the current situation was ultimately inappropriate. Meng Chong was startled when he saw old Master Zhang become serious once more. Then he laughed. But before he could respond, a voice suddenly rang out in the deepest part of his mind. The saint believes that he is the ruler of the world. This kind of bootlicking will be even more resounding. The method and content of the telepathic transmission were a bit discordant, but this wasn't the main point. The main point was the person who transmitted the telepathic transmission. First ablatum. Meng Chong's mind was shaken, and he subconsciously straightened his body. Jiang Yuanjun, who was beside him, did a similar action, but he sprained his old waist because he was too intense. Without a doubt, this was Mrs. Halder's telepathic transmission. It was just that there was no telepathic transmission after these words. Instead, a violent rumble arose in an even deeper and more sensitive domain. The Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District. Some of the other people in the conference room had reactions similar to Meng Chong's. There were also some who were muddled from beginning to end. But no matter which one it was, the elites selected by these orders were more or less linked to the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District in countless ways, directly or indirectly. When the foundation of the order underwent an intense change, no one could stay out of it. In the time of a breath or two, the originally clamorous conference room became so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. The vast majority of people only had a feeling in their hearts, but they were still ignorant of the concrete situation. Only people like Meng Chong, Wu Kuei, and Yin Lu, who was several thousand kilometers away, had sufficient cultivation and authority. Only the higher-ups of the order were able to sense it a step further. The turbulence came from the lowest level of the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District. It was a lake of lava that was condensed from the intense accumulation of negative emotions. What are you all hesitating for? Just execute according to what he said. We clearly have the lively substrate at the lowest level. Mobilize it. Mrs. Halder's telepathic transmission was like an unsheathed blade. Compared to her usual ruthless decisiveness, it was more concise and straightforward. Even if you're stupid to the point of being incurable, you still need to display your value. Ha! On Zeolite Beach, Luonan raised his eyebrows. He felt an unusual wave of restlessness from the depths of the Abyss District. It was extremely significant. His control over the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District exceeded practically everyone in the world. Of course he knew what this represented. He even knew the key driving force behind this wave of change. Mrs. Halder had woken up. However, she didn't seem to have any intentions of immediately exiting. She also didn't directly communicate with Luonan. Luonan didn't insist on this. This wave of assistance had already saved him some effort. Wind blew over from the surface of the sea. It carried a slight fishy smell, as well as some scattered remnants of mist. Luonan looked at the seemingly unchanged mist on the surface of the sea. It was as if the mist was surging and churning all the time. He silently calculated. He looked at the 5 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and their current degree of completeness. The standard relay station array and the Hellfire Tyrant. These 2 pieces were gradually on the right track. The magneto-optical mica. Yes. Wretched development. The vile environment and the overall space-time environment. This would depend on fate. Overall, there was still quite a bit of difference. However, this sort of piecing and organizing wasn't a linear process. Especially the first 2 pieces. They needed to rely on external forces when piecing them together. They were all broken up and needed to be reorganized and combed anew. However, as long as the foundation was solid, it would naturally be a different situation. Luonan let out a long breath and turned around. He saw Zhang Yingying doing her best to cheer Dumb Sand on. It looked like a scene of a family trip. She was having a great time. Luonan really couldn't treat the so-called son as a joke. However, if Zhang Yingying had to provide for this idiot all day long in the future, she would have to expend a great deal of mental energy. Just the daily supply of energy was enough to drag down her cultivation, let alone anything else. Luonan really did put in quite a bit of thought in order to resolve this matter satisfactorily. He seriously pondered over a method, prepared his words, and prepared everything. Only then did he call out, "Hey, Sister Yingying. I'm going to ask you again. Are you really determined to raise him?" "Of course I'm going to raise him." Zhang Yingying didn't hesitate at all in the beginning. She spoke resolutely and decisively, but a thought seemed to flash in the middle. It was unknown what she was thinking about. She became slightly absent-minded, and her momentum immediately suffered a setback. Luonan was puzzled. "What's wrong?" "Well, I'm going to ask you something. Dumb Sand is just an example given in class, right? Is there anything else? I mean, are there any other uses?" Luonan was startled for a moment, then he laughed. "I have to say there are." Zhang Yingying pursed her lips. She glanced at the distant Dumb Sand, but she soon withdrew her gaze. She wanted to say something, but in the end, she didn't say anything. Luonan already understood her thoughts. It was more or less outside of his expectations, but it also made him let out a sigh of relief. Sure enough, it was still the Zhang Yingying he knew. She was usually casual, but when she truly encountered something, she would never act according to her temper. She was clearly 100 times more attentive to Dumb Sand, but she still considered Luonan's experimental progress. She didn't act based on her own likes and dislikes. Her Majesty Empress Wu really taught her well. She was much better than a certain someone who fell in love with her when things went wrong. Cough. Luonan reflected on himself and encouraged himself. He grew more and more serious. "It's precisely because it's useful that I will cherish it in the future. Let's have a chat right now. Are you really going to raise it after this matter is over?" Zhang Yingying's entire body seemed to glow when she heard Luonan's words, which were practically a promise. Cough. That was an exaggeration. Her eyes glowed as she hurriedly declared, "Of course I'm going to raise it. Of course I'm going to raise it. It wasn't easy for me to raise it. I'm definitely going to continue raising it." She saw that Luo Nan was about to speak again, so she simply extended her palm. "I know you want to talk about the energy supply. You don't need to worry about this. I'll go find the boss and think of a way." Her Majesty Empress Wu wasn't a doryman. Luo Nan's retort got stuck in his throat. He swallowed it back with great difficulty, and he hurriedly used other words. "That's not necessary. We can think of a way to satisfy both sides." "Really?" Zhang Yingying responded quickly. Her eyes grew brighter and brighter. She was extremely pleasantly surprised. Clearly, she wasn't that certain whether Her Majesty Empress Wu would draw her blade to help or simply draw her blade. "Yeah. I just thought about it, and I have a new train of thought. It seems to be quite compatible with you." Taking advantage of Zhang Yingying's good mood, Luo Nan quickly thought through the words he had thought of in his mind. In the end, he cut the Gordian knot. Have you ever thought about letting dumb sand shed his body? Let his soul leave his body? Chapter 979. Huh. Zhang Yingying clearly didn't react in time. This clearly contradicted her usual direction of thought, or perhaps it was the ideal plan that she was looking forward to. So she was a bit muddled. She recovered with great difficulty and tried to understand. "You mean? Why don't you tell me about it?" Of course, this wasn't a problem. Luo Nan was used to lecturing. He casually condensed water vapor in the air to write on the blackboard. "Didn't I say it before? Your extraordinary power is extraordinarily suitable for nurturing. This is helpful in nurturing the sand demon. Yes, it's dumb sand's instinctive life form. That's the general situation." Luo Nan had just drawn a few configuration diagrams when he suddenly felt that it was inappropriate. He waved his hand and scattered them. A portion of dumb sand's current good state was indeed nourished by Zhang Yingying's extraordinary power. There were a few things worth talking about, but if he continued talking about it, it would be tantamount to probing the fundamental characteristics of Zhang Yingying's extraordinary power. It really wasn't appropriate to display it in this environment. The blackboard writing was erased, but the model in Luo Nan's mind was still there. It was hard not to be puzzled. It was the same old question. Based on these characteristics, Zhang Yingying should be similar to Brother Papercut, the type that leaned toward support. If her thinking could keep up with configuration, she would be a good seedling for the school of fantasy, especially when it came to simulating life. But how could she possibly have a killing ability like White Rainbow? Could it be that my segmentation and reorganization aren't there yet, and I've overlooked a certain key structure? Luo Nan felt that it was necessary to discuss this matter with Her Majesty Empress Wu. He wouldn't say it right now, as it would only cause confusion. In fact, Zhang Yingying was already a bit impatient. She urged him over and over, "Hurry up and get to the point. I don't understand it anyway. Just announce the answer." It was impossible for Luo Nan to directly say the answer. He had to let Zhang Yingying understand the gist of it. "This is what I'm thinking. Dumb sand is indeed an artificial creation designed at the last minute. Its life solvent is simulated. It doesn't have a material foundation, so it can't be considered a true life. However, its value lies in the fact that it can form a second end of the life layer on the basis of these simulated configurations. Of course, it also has your nourishment. It achieves the effect of being driven by desire, and it continues to grow. If we can maintain this momentum and allow it to continue optimizing and evolving, in theory, we can develop a third, fourth, and finally perfect interference mechanism of the life layer. By then, in a sense, it will be a life. But you have to understand that this is only a theoretical possibility." Zhang Yingying started to get into the zone. She became calmer and calmer, and her mind became clearer. "I know, I can't possibly have so much energy supply. The various consumptions required are also astronomical figures, right?" Luo Nan nodded. "That's right." Zhang Yingying's gaze circled around silly sand again. When she turned back, she couldn't help but feel a little more expectant. "What about maintaining the status quo? I think it's pretty good now. This is a complex system. Who has ever seen a system that doesn't make mistakes? especially when it was exposed to a complicated environment and had a very close relationship with you. Any slight change in these aspects could lead to a complete collapse in the end. Luo Nan slightly evaded Zhang Yingying's gaze and looked at Silly Sand. If I was by your side, Her Majesty Empress Wu should be able to fix it in time. But the more time passes, the related configurations will continue to combine and mutate. The system will become more and more complex, and the problems will become more and more violent. A moment of carelessness will cause problems to erupt in the time you take a nap. You won't even have time to react. Zhang Yingying went silent when she heard this. A few seconds later, she suddenly laughed. I forgot. I told you to just say the answer. Luo Nan laughed as well, and he spoke a bit faster. There are many difficult checkpoints in my thoughts, but I won't go into the specifics. My basic train of thought is that we shouldn't focus on the life layer. It has an innate flaw, and it is destined to have no future to speak of. We can start with Silly Sand's relatively good foundation of a super configuration. We can use a few methods that spoil things to help them grow, and we can forcefully raise its mechanism of existence in the life layer to the fantasy layer. Zhang Yingying couldn't help but feel a bit dizzy when she heard the answer. She tried to organize her thoughts. You're saying, from the life layer to the fantasy layer? Is it the leap you're talking about? It's far from reaching the qualifications to leap. That's why I said to spoil things to help them grow. But we can also connect it with cultivation in reality. Many of the mental side's life mechanisms aren't all that perfect, but aren't they still able to leave their bodies? It's not much at all, okay? Don't use your special experience to cover the general domain. Forget it. Continue. Zhang Yingying gave up struggling. Luo Nan continued to speak honestly. From what I can see, the difficulty isn't bad. Its current mechanism of existence, its primary perception, desires and experience structure, is 1,000 times, 10,000 times simpler than that of humans. We just need to build a bridge, or perhaps a compiler, to push it to the mental plane. We can let it live in the sea of the mind as a unique life form. Zhang Yingying couldn't help but widen her eyes. There's such a method. You want it to directly become an immortal? When that happens, will Silly Sand still be Silly Sand? Why wouldn't it be? The bridge is also in the sense of configuration. For example, it's the same as flipping a card. Silly Sand's form is flipped from the material plane to the mental plane, but it's still a card. Of course it's done this way. Its existence isn't much higher than it is right now. It's a bit like a ghost or something. But it saves a lot of trouble. It can attach itself to the edge of your soul strength to charge. It's similar to adding a pendant to your cage. Of course it can also fly freely. It can live and die by itself in the sea of the mind. As long as it can learn to absorb energy from the outside world on the mental plane, it can constantly search for a suitable survival mechanism for itself. It will have the opportunity to continue growing stronger. When it's powerful to a certain degree, you can even summon it from the mental plane to the material plane. You can temporarily bestow it with some kind of material carrier. Its origin is sand. Sand is the best. Mud is fine too. Let it interfere with the material plane. Speaking of which, I originally wanted to recommend this method to Brother Papercut. If, and I'm saying if, it can break through a few critical checkpoints and enter the next level, then it can enter the abyss region from the sea of the mind and finally solidify. Entering the abyss area from the spiritual sea and finally solidifying was basically a perfect state. Most likely, more abilities would be developed. There's a special name for this type of life form. It's called fantasy breed. Luo Nan said so much in a single breath. This was tantamount to simplifying the heavenly Yuan Empire's definition of fantasy breeds to the extreme. He even secretly swapped out some of the core and explained it to Zhang Yingying. Of course, fantasy breeds weren't that simple. They didn't have the luck and fortune of the right time and place. They didn't have the faith of millions and millions of people to rely on. They didn't have the perfect structure to carry the load and sustain the changes. How could they become fantasy breeds? What Luo Nan said was just a path of artificial fantasy breeds from the School of Fantasy. From the information given to him by Lieutenant Go Yi, there were quite a few similar creations during the peak of the School of Fantasy. Right now, he was actually following this path. He was carrying out an extremely crucial experimental step, and dumb sand was closely related to it. As for the success rate, it should be quite good. Otherwise, wouldn't the School of Fantasy not live up to its name? Luo Nen actually had the intention of delaying the enemy by bringing out this method. This was because there was still a period of adjustment to follow. Let's do it this way. Ha! Luo Nan was still pondering over how he should continue to persuade her and how he should make Zhang Yingying cooperate. He never expected her to be this straightforward, directly making the decision. Zhang Yingying's reasoning was sufficient and powerful. Dumb sand was originally created by you. There is no one under the heavens who understands it better than you. As long as you don't engage in segmented research, human destruction, and the like, then of course whatever you say will go. If you say it like that, then I'll... Luo Nen let out a breath of relief. He had only spoken halfway when Zhang Yingying suddenly rushed forward and grabbed him by the collar with enormous strength. Fortunately, Luo Nan's soul strength was constantly recovering. His long-range projection technique was excellent, and his foundation with the condensation ring was solid. This fake water vapor body was not directly crushed by this one grab. However, the visual impact brought about by the face that was practically right in front of his eyes made Luo Nen instinctively raise his hands to show his innocence. Zhang Yingying didn't think too much. She stared at Luo Nan's pupils, which were practically unable to see any traces of falsehood. She exerted a great deal of strength, seemingly piercing through space and time to transmit her will to Luo Nan's body several thousand kilometers away. I can understand your difficulties, but I hope you can understand my willfulness. Let's not deceive each other, okay? Frankly speaking, Luo Nan didn't know why Zhang Yingying was so concerned about dumb sand. The so-called oxytocin secretion didn't seem like a joke at all. But how could he possibly refuse when faced with this sort of face and this sort of attitude? I understand. We'll work hard together to complete this matter. I'm sure. Luo Nen originally wanted to say, I'm confident, but he changed his words when the words reached his mouth. But he did have a certain amount of confidence. This was because in the worst-case scenario, he could still give Zhang Yingying a trip ahead of time. It was better to speak less of such words right now. Luo Nan was just stating the facts. We can't gamble right now. We still need to nurture dumb sand for a period of time. We need to wait until the system of its superconfiguration becomes more stable. The embryonic virtual life forms level becomes clearer and more useful as a marker. We also need to consider the work of building bridges and flipping cards. As long as we can successfully push it to the mental plane, our chances of success will be higher. During this time, you can also learn some basic knowledge about fantasy configurations. You can make preparations for the brand new husbandry model in the future. You have this talent. I'm certain. Luo Nan spoke these last words from the bottom of his heart. There was not the slightest bit of discount or exaggeration. Chapter 980. The matter of dumb sand's future adoption came to an end. Zhang Yingying revealed a bright smile. It was as if she had erased all her worries. She ran to the edge of the formatting domain and loudly cheered dumb sand on. Because of the scene just now, the live broadcast viewers from all over the world seemed to be gossiping. This was nothing to Zhang Yingying and Luo Nan. Well, Luo Nan simply didn't know. His mind was completely focused on Zeolite Beach. In the following period of time, he needed to realize his own experimental designs and goals, and he also needed to accept Zhang Yingying's request. Though the tasks had increased, he did not feel that it was hard. He did not feel that it was an additional burden. This was indeed the case. In terms of superconfiguration, the experimental steps he was about to do did not fundamentally conflict with helping dumb sand's soul leave his body. The two were closely related to each other. At most, dumb sand, the little white mouse he had created, had the position of a biological son reserved for someone else. Another identity was added, and dumb sand needed to be carefully protected. He did not want to accidentally crush dumb sand to death. He absolutely had to remember this. Luo Nan emphasized this a few times in his mind and went to look at dumb sand. Unlike Zhang Yingying's purely emotional attention, what appeared in Luo Nan's eyes was never a simple individual or an ant colony. It was more like a specific character in a play he directed. Before the label of Zhang Yingying's biological son was attached, there was already an extremely concrete position. It was not just dumb sand. Everyone on Zeolite Beach other than Zhang Yingying was no exception. Right now, it was approximately 1 in the afternoon in D City. The flow of time seemed to be growing faster and faster. Luckily, Luo Nan could sense that the order on Zeolite Beach was in the process of accelerating its formation according to his original design. With Shinha at the center, more than 30 experiment equipment were scattered in various locations on the beach, taking up the largest area. The syncopators, which had been supplemented, were like hundreds of clamps that clamped the void and split curtain above their heads into a hole. Luo Nan knew that Shinha and the others wished to break away from all syncopators. They wanted to be able to allow the formatting domain, which was not restricted by the dynamo core, to exist normally. But unfortunately, it was basically impossible for them to reach this level. It wasn't that Luo Nan was holding back. It was just that they didn't understand what sort of environmental state this sandy terrain, which Luo Nan had single-handedly created, represented. Without personally participating in that dream, without living, fighting, and struggling in that kind of environment, they were destined to be separated by a layer of unbreakable cognitive barrier. Not to mention that the other two blocks that were in a state of confrontation were still hidden and complicated reserved spaces. Therefore, they had already trampled through many gullies and piles of sand that Luo Nan had personally dug. That was why they played the game of you run and I run with dumb sand. They never thought of encircling, intercepting, repelling, and annihilating dumb sand. Luo Nan didn't mind this at all. He also had no intention of publicizing his tense, unique, and miraculous experience to more people. There were some links that couldn't be left to others. They had to go through his own hands, and only his own hands. After making a rough estimation, he slowly walked towards the formatting domain on the beach. Everyone on the beach, as well as the live stream viewers who were staring at the beach, were still very sensitive even after 3 or 4 hours of indoctrination and torture. They suddenly became nervous. Even Zhang Yingying, who was wholeheartedly cheering for her own son, subconsciously gave Luo Nan a shot. Luo Nan took the opportunity to point at her from a distance. Be careful. Stay a bit further away. Fuck. Was he going to make a big move? Luo Nan's path just so happened to pass by Hood's vicinity. This captain, who was the most powerful on the beach and had the most advanced dynamo core implanted, could not help but feel his heart twitch. Right now, Hood was already acting according to Luo Nan's arrangements. He had completely become an outstanding valve, assisting the main axis, Shinha. He adjusted the fluctuating energy of the 30 or so burners, allowing them to establish a strict and free domain in this area that wasn't all that vast. He believed that he had already done quite well. Compared to the trembling Shinha, he was already able to move freely within the formatting domain. He was able to find a few key nodes and carry out preemptive adjustments. He could even restart the mission assigned by the laboratory, sending back all sorts of monitoring and sensing data in an unending stream, assisting the other side to carry out some hidden tests remotely. But when Luo Nan walked past him, Hood could not help but be stimulated. He straightened his body to maintain the most standard and most rigid posture. Luo Nan ignored him. He just waved his hand at Zhang Yingying from a distance. Don't mind stupid sand. He's useful. This made Hood wake up from his stupor. The realization from earlier floated up in his mind once more. Everyone on the beach, including the things, were all designed by the person who just walked past. Now, it was finally time to activate it? Hold on. All sorts of distracting thoughts flashed through Hood's mind. Only now did he discover that Luo Nan had already entered. This person had long since entered the range of the formatting domain. There were no traces of the format of fire operating on his body. He was like a tourist taking a stroll on the beach, his gaze casually sweeping across various locations. He looked very little at the people, but he looked a lot at the scenery. Hood did not find it strange that Luo Nan had the ability to enter and exit as he pleased. After all, this was something that Luo Nan had single-handedly created. The 100 or so centimeters that buzzed and floated above his head were the symbol of Luo Nan's strength. It was just that he was currently shouldering the heavy responsibility of monitoring Luo Nan. One of the most important tasks was to make a good record of Luo Nan's state when Luo Nan was in close contact with the formatting domain for future research. Hood subconsciously followed Luo Nan, but he felt that he was being impulsive the moment he took a step forward. Sure enough, Luo Nan stopped in front of him and turned his head to look over. Hood was extremely embarrassed. He never expected Luo Nan to nod. Come on then. There's something I need to arrange. Okay. Hood did not have the courage to refuse at all. He took 2 quick steps and followed behind Luo Nan. Luo Nan did not give him a direct order. Instead, he turned his head and walked forward. He was neither fast nor slow. Looking at the direction, it seemed that he wanted to go to the edge of the beach. There was a sports car parked there. It seemed to belong to Meng Chong of the Blood Flame Order. That fellow had been gone for a few hours. Who knew what he was up to? Weren't the two going to meet later? What was Luo Nan doing? Was he shaking people? Hood's thoughts fluctuated in his mind, but he was unable to grasp the main point. Right now, he was hoping that the special communication channel would give him clear instructions. But the other side seemed to be worried that Luo Nan would discover them. They entered a state of silence. Luo Nan walked all the way to the sports car before stopping. Hood stopped when Luo Nan stopped. Hood's eyes were sharp. He noticed that a large circle was clearly drawn on the sand beneath the sports car. It was very orderly, encircling the entire car within. No area protruded out. B. Headquarters. The first few words were a bit vague. Luo Nan stood outside the circle and pointed at the car. The beach might be a bit messy, but it might not be that messy. In any case, you guys absolutely cannot allow any shockwaves to enter this circle and harm this car. So you really want to be a demon? Go say these words to the main axis. These were Hood's first 2 thoughts. This was also the root of his arrogance. The problem was that he displayed it outwardly, so he could only nod obediently. In the end, he felt that it wasn't enough, so he repeated himself. This is the headquarters. We absolutely cannot allow any shockwaves to enter the circle and harm the sports car. Luo Nan nodded. He turned around and gazed into the distance toward the ocean. Hood copied him and turned around. From this position, he could see the entire beach. He could see everything at a glance. Hood confirmed once more that the overall layout of the beach had certainly gone through special planning. The Deep Blue Walker experimental machine, which was countless generations behind, was parked at the end of the beach. Its position just so happened to be in the direction the sports car was pointing. The two formed a central axis, dividing the beach into 2 halves. In addition, there were a few undulating piles of sand and gullies. They shouldn't have been randomly arranged. They were distributed in disorder, giving off a rather layered feeling. They formed an even more detailed layout structure. As for where the marvels lay, Luo Nan was unable to discern them in a short amount of time. He could only do his best to record these things and transmit them to the rear so that they could analyze and interpret them. However, the problem right now was that the originally neat layout had become exceptionally messy because of the several dozen burners. Should I go pile up sand next? Huda wasn't unhappy about this. It would be great if he could seize this opportunity to grasp a few key structures and techniques. Luo Nan didn't issue any similar orders after waiting for a while. Instead, he thought of something else and added, "Stupid sand crossing the line won't do either." Huh! Hood was at a loss. He followed Luo Nan's line of sight and looked at stupid sand, which was still 100 meters away. With that thing's speed, it would take an hour to force its way over even if it didn't change its anchoring direction. Was this a mockery? Oh, it won't be able to crawl over in a short amount of time. However, we need to set up a boundary in front of us. Luo Nan's voice had just fallen when an incorporeal force suddenly took effect in the coastal area of the beach, about 30 meters behind the Deep Blue Walker exoskeleton. A portion of the sand slowly caved in, revealing a gully that was 10 meters long, half a meter deep, and about the width of a palm. It was perpendicular to the central axis formed by the sports car and the exoskeleton. That area just so happened to be a relatively densely populated area. There were a few burners nearby, and they were adjusting their positions in order to adapt to the formatted domain. One of them was overly nervous when encountering such an unforeseen event. His energy was misaligned, and he suffered a backlash from the domain. Arcs of light whipped him, and the others around him suffered a calamity as a dazzling ball of light exploded. No matter what was said, Hood had a role as a valve. Even though he didn't have any direct subordinates over there, it still made him lose face. He subconsciously said, "Professor Luo, don't blame me. These cowards lack training. I didn't expect you to have a particularly high level. Time doesn't allow for it." Hood vaguely remembered that Luo Nan planned to board a ship at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and leave T-City. This meant that... Bah! What the hell was I worrying about? Chapter 981. Hood was seriously dissatisfied with his family's overly weak mentality, but who cared about this at this time? Luo Nan continued to emphasize the topic related to stupid sand. That 30-meter line is your defensive position. Stupid sand cannot be allowed to pass through no matter what. Well, you guys aren't so shameful as to use direct attacks, right? How would we dare to attack the son of a dog couple? Hood straightened his back in the next second and simply responded, "Understood. Direct attacks are not allowed. Stupid sand is not allowed to cross the 30-meter line." "Then that's fine. Next, you guys can return to your positions." "Return to my positions." Hood was stupefied. He saw Luo Nan wave his hand, and a row of condensed numbers appeared out of thin air as they approached the rear area of the sports car camp. It was similar to the blackboard writing left behind by the sea, but it was much more sparse. Then it continued to increase and expand the area of coverage. Whether it was outside the relatively stable formatted domain or within the fluctuating and turbulent domain, these illusory and fragile water vapor could always take form and mark their positions. Most importantly, these condensed numbers were clearly divided into zones. The spacing was roughly the same, and they were randomly distributed. They were like marks on a somewhat irregular chessboard. F***CK. Isn't this just a sand table? Hood looked at the condensed numbers from 1 to 35. The order in which they appeared was not fixed, and there was no pattern to their positions. However, the total number just happened to be the number of burners on the beach. They were missing one. Hood blinked his eyes. He was pondering and guessing at the logic within when Luo Nan snapped his fingers beside him. They were almost completely synchronized, and a small number floated above the heads of all the burners on the beach. It ranged from 1 to 35, corresponding to everyone. They were still missing one. Hood subconsciously raised his head. His chin had just stuck up halfway when he heard Luo Nan speak. "You don't have a point number. You're responsible for maneuver adjustments. Make the person number correspond to the area number. Limit the range of movement. Thank you for your trust." "Thank your mother." "Yes, understood," Hood responded in a loud voice. Due to Luo Nan's continuous operation, there was a bit of chaos on Zeolite Beach. Luo Nan was worthy of being the #1 user of the condensation ring aside from Her Majesty Empress Wu. His control over water vapor had reached perfection. Many people did not realize from beginning to end that the numbers above their heads had already been engraved. Using this kind of operation in the field of formatting made Hood's scalp go numb. He could not help but think to himself, would any burner who watched the live broadcast have the courage to form a formation and fight against Luo Nan in the future? That was a little far-fetched. The direct cause of the chaos was Luo Nan's continuous construction on the beach aside from controlling the water vapor. He himself did not move, but wherever his thoughts went, the beach would rise, collapse, or be compacted, or be torn apart, divided horizontally and vertically, arbitrarily planned. It was a godly operation that would frustrate any controller of formatting domain. But the most direct impact was that Xiaofan and a group of military elites had their hands and feet tied. They were afraid of accidentally tripping. No, they were afraid of destroying Professor Luo's profound layout. They should be content. Soon, they wouldn't be able to move even if they wanted to. Hood's face twitched slightly. He benefited from following Luo Nan's observation perspective. Right now, he had a macroscopic concept of the layout. But it was also because of this that he was able to truly confirm that everything he saw Luo Nan do had a basis. Luo Nan's methods were strict. Everyone had a fixed position. Everything was a chessboard and chess piece that Luo Nan had planned out. One could imagine that Luo Nan certainly had a clearer, more realistic, and more concrete point of reference in his mind. But what was that point of reference? Luo Nan's gaze swept over while his thoughts were running wild. Hood was agitated, but then he suddenly realized that he should go do something. He should go organize the order on the beach to make it conform to Luo Nan's requirements. He should make everyone occupy their positions and combine with the delineated chessboard to form the situation Luo Nan needed. This job was easy to do. Everyone was basically a soldier or had a military background. Discipline and obedience were guaranteed. Luo Nan's marking was extremely clear, so there was no need to put too much effort into it. This was especially true when he saw Xiaofan, who was the main axis, follow Hood's orders and board the cabin with a stupefied expression. He entered the super simple and crude Deep Blue Walker experimental machine. Hood's sullen mood from the morning dissipated by half. In just a few minutes, the originally chaotic zeolite beach entered a relatively peaceful and silent state. All the experimental equipment with the markings above their heads stood in their positions. The formatting domain formed by several dozen people covered nearly the entire beach as a matter of course. However, it was a bit unstable right now, so much so that the floating sandball model displayed a large degree of distortion and deformation. This was Hood's responsibility, needless to say. Hood didn't dare to meet Luo Nan's eyes. He relied on his understanding of the current structure of the domain to rush to various areas of the beach. He constantly adjusted the swaying energy flow due to the position changes, ensuring the basic stability of the formatting domain. Hood couldn't help but think at the beginning of his rush. Did Luo Nan use this method to push him out of the entire system? He exerted himself, but he was unable to participate personally. But soon, Hood discovered that this wasn't the case at all. No matter what angle he looked at it from, he was more capable of challenging himself than the experimental equipment who were entrenched in a domain. He had a greater perspective on the overall situation, and he was more capable of seeing through all the visible and invisible details on the beach. So much so that after running back and forth 7 or 8 times, he wanted to immediately apply for the Apocalypse Opening Arrays access test to the laboratory. I've most likely already leveled up. Later on, Hood even felt that he had developed some sort of new supernatural power. He seemed to be able to look through the formatting domain and see the deeper layers of laws and logos behind realization. The most typical thing was that he could faintly sense that the sandy beaches, gullies, piles, and groups that Luo Nan had arranged on the beach all had their own explanations. Specifically speaking, they were able to conduct some sort of channeling, separation, disturbance, and even amplification of the formatting domain. But these were just grains of sand without any processing whatsoever. Is this also the result of the legendary superconfiguration? A hidden signal wave suddenly interfered. It was the laboratory reopening the communication channel and giving him a clear order. Continue to observe and analyze the coupling between the structure of the beach and the domain space. Send back the results. Do you really think my brain capacity is limitless? I'm just a tiny front end. The dynamo core in my corpus callosum isn't even the size of a fingernail. How can I have enough computing power? Hood wiped his face. Unknowingly, he had already achieved the untimely achievement of being drenched in sweat by the seaside in early winter due to the consumption of large amounts of mental and physical energy. But before he could complain back, the prompts for the temporary privilege upgrade rang out in succession. Holy sh*T, the Apocalypse Opening Array had automatically responded and supported him. Was he enjoying the treatment of Yen Yongbu's supervisor in advance? Hood's mind was racking with calculations, but his mood was high. He put in even more effort into his work. Both sides were like this. They complemented each other. But why didn't he feel any changes after running another lap? The feeling was still fuzzy. It was still fuzzy. It could be said that there was some progress. But whether it was adjustments or analysis, he always felt that he was still floating on the same surface. He was unable to sink no matter what. During this time, the Apocalypse Opening Array's support privileges were upgraded once more. The dynamo core was about to enter an overclocked state. Only Yen Yongbu's superior architecture could forcefully raise the analytical ability to a higher level. The laboratory clearly had no plans to further open its privileges. Yen Yongbu was hiding in some corner of T-City. He had no intention of making a move. The situation of Hood's drenched in sweat had not been alleviated. He wiped his sweat again. In the end, he could not help but turn his head to look at the youth leaning against the hood of the sports car. There was a thought stirring in his mind. This kid. How in the world did he do it? Hood caught Luo Nan's gaze at this time. He subconsciously followed the direction and turned his head once more. This time he saw dumb sand. This monster, which they had played a game of cat and mouse with for nearly an hour, had received some unknown influence or command. It had changed its direction and was slowly crawling inland. Hold on. That's the direction of the sports car's headquarters. That's not right. Hood wiped the beads of sweat on his eyelashes. He suddenly realized that with the establishment of the beach chessboard and the gradual adjustment and stabilization of the formatting domain, the sandball model, which had barely recovered to a regular state, had automatically moved to the central axis of the beach. Its position was right in the middle of the central axis. Hood hated that he could not only consider this as a coincidence in such a situation. He felt a splitting headache if he thought about it even a little more. How could this be a coincidence? Hood rubbed his head. His eyeballs quickly moved back and forth before he caught up to dumb sand. As he continued to deepen his understanding of the layout of the beach, he was already able to see that dumb sand's conflict with the formatting domain was growing sharper and sharper by purely considering the direction and efficiency of its interference. Perhaps it had been like this before. It was just that a bunch of idiots were completely unaware of it. The laboratory had timely transmitted over a small piece of code. It was said that the code was specially optimized for observing dumb sand's form. The analysis carried out by the laboratory was certainly more profound and thorough than Hood's short-term understanding. The small results they produced were still a bit useful. As the relevant sensing mode leveled up, Hood could clearly sense that dumb sand's body was constantly crawling and flowing forward. Its body shape was constantly undergoing minute changes. Through its conflict with the formatting domain, Hood could indirectly prove that its skeletal structure and the deeper flow and operation of energy were changing much more intensely than what had appeared on the surface. According to what Luo Nan had said, its superconfiguration system was constantly being improved. Was it beginning a new round of evolution? What a joke! Did he really think that there was a supercomputer and a nuclear power plant buried under the beach? Chapter 982. Whether it was Hood's logic or the results of the front-end calculations, there was an inescapable hole in both. Zhang Yingying's humanoid battery had already fallen to the point where it only knew how to shout, 666, from the outside. It clearly did not have any more input. Dumb sand itself had a slight increase in the energy devouring of the formatting domain, but it did not have the qualifications to drive this sort of super energy-consuming optimization that required even more powerful computing power. Luo Nan was supporting it? Perhaps this was an explanation that could barely be accepted, but the problem was that Luo Nan had clearly said before that he needed to maintain objectivity and reduce the disturbance to the experimental conditions. From the looks of things, he had basically done it. There was no need to deceive himself. Unless his true experimental target was none other than this stupid and unyielding monster that only knew how to crawl forward. What live broadcast classes, what examples, they were all methods to deceive people. Hood had a sudden realization when he thought of this. He had the impulse to pick up dumb sand and snatch it back to the laboratory. Fortunately, he had not gone crazy to the point of disregarding everything, even though he was working hard for the Apocalypse Laboratory. Cool-headedness and rationality pushed his train of thought to continue walking a step deeper. If Luo Nan had been supporting dumb sand's evolution from the shadows, how did he do it? Luo Nan was without a doubt a powerful expert of the mental side. He was the one who proposed the cage theory, and he was a master of mental senses. The safest route was obviously interference on the mental plane. Hood was rather self-aware. He knew very well that compared to the energy and information structure of the material plane, the mental domain was the weakness of these people and even the entire Deep Blue platform system. Up until now, no burner had reached the level of an extraordinary, and that was a strong proof. The newly opened Apocalypse Array was much more brilliant, but its specific effects needed to be tested with time and actual combat. Therefore, Hood did not expect himself to make some great discovery in this area. He just wanted Luo Nan to have an extremely brilliant interference channel that exceeded the scope of everyone's observation. But there was one more point. Dumb sand, this simulated life creation, was the support for its current evolutionary speed. Even if Luo Nan. Where was Luo Nan's support? The enormous energy consumption was fine. He was an extraordinary. A monster of this level could not be discussed with common sense. But the resources needed for dumb sand's quasi-life evolution, and perhaps the extremely complex and rigorous design of Zeolite Beach. Where did this astronomical computing power come from? Although various experiences and experiments had shown that the intelligence of extraordinaries was generally much higher than that of ordinary people, their performance in memory, precise logic, and other areas that could be tested were also superhuman. But there had never been any evidence that the brain of an extraordinary could race against a supercomputer. In fact, the basic operating model of the human brain determined that in the field of processing large amounts of information and big data analysis, people had to rely on external objects. There was a statistic that stated that 5% to 8% of the world's supercomputing resources were controlled by the inner world for a long period of time and used for various cultivation experiments, model building, and analysis work. It was the same everywhere in the world. What made you, Professor Luo Nan, think that you could ignore the basic rules and seize a huge amount of computing power from nothingness and use it? Inexcusable. Truly inexcusable. Hood couldn't get around the logical holes, so he naturally let his imagination run wild. He even began to suspect right now that Luo Nan was a fellow that had undergone transformation. Luo Nan had also been implanted with a dynamo core. Moreover, it was a special type, possessing a powerful computing ability that exceeded that of a normal person. Damn it! It was impossible to implant a supercomputer into Luo Nan's brain, right? But then again, if it was just a remote link. Hood turned his head to look at Luo Nan once more, but Luo Nan's gaze had already left the concrete changes on the beach. It was cast towards the boundless sea and sky. Of course, in order to see into the distance, one first had to penetrate the wall of hazy fog in front of them. It seemed like that mass of fog was also tossed about by Luo Nan. What was inside that fog? His eyebrows furrowed and relaxed. He rarely took the initiative to send a message to the command center. His wild imagination seemed to be able to make sense from a logical point of view, as well as the small stirrings he received just now. 1. Investigate the entire world's supercomputing resources. 2. Monitor the massive fog on the sea's surface. Hood knew that if he could think of this, the group of people in the laboratory could probably think of it as well. But he was being played like a chess piece in broad daylight. He really couldn't swallow this anger if he didn't seize the opportunity to tear down the stage. It would be great if he could really find something by following the vines to the melon. But if he couldn't find anything, he couldn't just use this to confirm that Luo Nan's power and resources all came from the legendary new plane. While he was still pondering, Hood felt a slight chill on his forehead. Beads of water hit his forehead. It's raining? He subconsciously raised his head. The sunlight was hazy, but it was still there. Then this bead of water. Hood's eyelids jumped twice, and he looked back in Luo Nan's direction. Over there, Luo Nan was still gazing into the distance. Moreover, his neck was raised high, as if he was looking at the color of the sky. What's so good about a cloudy day? Is it to observe the stars? Hood cursed again. He nearly believed that the bead of water that fell on his forehead was just an illusion. But Luo Nan seemed to have sensed something in the next second. He turned his head to look over. His gaze wasn't all that sharp, but Hood felt the coolness of the bead of water penetrate his skull and seep into his heart. Fuck, why the hell am I arguing with this master of mental senses who invented the prison theory? Hood immediately became terrified. He lowered his head and forcefully restrained all his thoughts. He buried his head into Luo Nan's various arrangements. His mental activities were a bit richer. He could be considered useful. Luo Nan gave a brief evaluation to the fellow running back and forth on the beach. Then he collected his mind and reached out to pinch the space between his eyebrows. He made a slight adjustment, and then he raised his head to look at stupid sand crawling left and right along the central axis. Actually, Luo Nan knew that this silly fellow was one of the brightest targets on the beach. Who knew how many cameras and detectors were shooting at it through the air? How many supercomputer resources were mobilized because of it? And there were several extraordinaries around D City, including Her Majesty Empress Wu, on the even more illusory and distant mental plane. They weren't idle either. There was certainly pressure, and Luo Nan didn't want it to be like this. How could a person with his personality play in such a high-profile manner if it wasn't necessary? Time was truly tight, and resources were scarce. If Luo Nan could find an opportunity to fleece some wool, he wouldn't care about it no matter what. Luo Nan gazed quietly, carefully evaluating the sand. In a certain sense, stupid sand was a testing machine, a screening machine. People of different levels saw completely different scenes. At this stage, the entire skeleton of stupid sand still lacked stability. Old grains of sand were constantly breaking off and losing their activity, but new grains of sand were irradiated and stuck to it, adding to its structural improvement. This was the most objective observation result. The vast majority of people heard Luo Nan say this, and they thought this way. There was no mistake. If they carefully memorized it, they might gradually comprehend a deeper level of understanding in the future. However, some people could only see its headless and tailless appearance, as well as its silly reactions. Even if they listened to Luo Nan's explanation, most of them would just watch the show in the end. These people were completely uninitiated, and they weren't paying attention. They didn't care about Luo Nan, and they didn't need to expend any effort. There were also some people who more or less captured the laws of stupid sand structural adjustments based on Luo Nan's lectures. They recognized the interaction between this fellow and the external environment, and they even made some inductive inferences. Being able to reach this step meant that stupid sand already possessed the initial level of structural thinking. Hood was not bad. He was really not bad. Even though he borrowed the help of the formatting domain to indirectly map the relevant structural clues, being able to reach this step proved that he had brains and talent. This was already an effective calculation node. If there were a few more people like Hood in the live broadcast audience of the entire world, Luo Nan would have quite a bit of time to think about it. It was just that Hood still had a long way to go before he could see through stupid sand's structural state and meaning. As for extraordinaries, forget it. In any case, they were mostly useless right now, so there was no need to spend too much effort on them. In any case, in the eyes of its creator Luo Nan, the true stupid sand was a state that was 1,000 times, 10,000 times more complicated. It wasn't just a simple creation of sand. Its complexity wasn't reflected in the tens of thousands of grains of sand that made up its skeleton. Instead, it went outwards. If one were to describe it directly, stupid sand was like an exerciser running on a beach. On its back was a huge parachute. The parachute was formless, but the pulling force was real. The dense and fine parachute ropes were gathered on every effective superconfiguration structure of stupid sand skeleton. This added an immeasurable degree of complexity to its already extremely complex body movements, and it also brought about enormous resistance. But the matter could also be looked at the other way around. The ropes that were holding dumb sand back could be said to be the puppeteer's strings of control. As for dumb sand, it was just a puppet that was being controlled. The strings of control, and the even bigger puppeteer behind them were the core of all the activities. Zhang Yingying could accept the first description with some difficulty. But Luo Nan knew that it was also an inappropriate description. The second description was closer to the truth. But regardless of whether it was stupid sand pulling the parachute ropes or the strings of control controlling stupid sand, there really was a big fellow behind these invisible ropes. It was a colossus that was far more complex than stupid sand's living system by millions and millions of times. The invisible ropes pierced through the void and cast towards the thick and rolling sea surface. They hooked and pulled, interacting with the main body of the hazy fog at a high frequency. Right now, rotors would occasionally break through the smoke barrier at the edges of the enormous fog on the sea surface, probing in and out. In the deeper regions, there were even more concealed triamphibious detectors that continuously operated above and below the water, taking samples. Many people were paying special attention to the fog. They had already walked far ahead of Hood. They were just ordinary machines. They could at most disturb the semi-incorporeal aerosol structure in the air, and disturb the distribution of a small portion of the water droplets. They lacked the ability to sense and interfere with the more complex level of the superconfiguration that connected the structure. Even though the enormous superconfiguration system hidden in the mist was far from taking shape. Luo Nan really wanted to call it a magneto-optical mica, but he really didn't have the face to describe it this way. Let's just call it mica. Chapter 983. This creation could barely be called the predecessor of the magneto-optical mica jellyfish. Luo Nan had started from the theory of the school of fantasy. He had referred to the database of fantasy mimicry configuration techniques, and slowly pieced them together to create it. The school of fantasy was not just named because of fantasy configurations. It was also because this school had done extremely deep research into fantasy breeds. They had even formed a complete and grand system from this. But in the end, they were unable to resist the environment polluted by sin poison, and so they ultimately declined. High-profile existences like the magneto-optical mica jellyfish were certainly their research targets. Although they did not truly dissect and restore this legendary configuration creation invented by an inconceivably powerful existence, they did develop a few fragmented imitation works. These were all classic works that had stood the test of time. These configuration works were completely worthless under the environment polluted by sin poison. But Luo Nan was not in the light concealment galaxy. He was on Earth right now, so there were basically no taboos. Luo Nan had the legacy of these predecessors and the relatively clear memory modules that were deeply rooted in the palace of his own mental domain. Only then was Luo Nan able to smoothly cut into it. But no matter how much of a foundation he had and how much of a path he had, He had to abide by basic laws in order to simulate and create a powerful fantasy breed. He still needed to realize the continuous leap from the material plane to the life plane to the fantasy plane. It was impossible to accomplish everything in one step. According to Luo Nan's own observations and the research results of the School of Fantasy, he could only create a magneto-optical mica jellyfish with clouds as the foundation of the material plane. This was good luck for Luo Nan. He had learned the condensation ring from Her Majesty Empress Wu. It was simply a match made in heaven. However, the relevant configurations were too high-end as he went down. It was impossible for Lieutenant Go Yi to clearly explain every step of the fantasy mimicry technique. There were too many missing thumb links. He needed to be like stupid sand and undergo large-scale, rapid iterative experiments and screening. In comparison, stupid sand's paltry 33 generations of artificial choices couldn't even be considered a formality. In fact, Stupid Sand's lifelike super-configuration system was something Luo Nan had extracted from the database of the fantasy mimicry technique. A considerable portion of it was based on the servant army of the magneto-optical mica jellyfish. These demons and monsters were all subdued and even pieced together by the magneto-optical mica jellyfish's soul magnetization power. To a certain extent, his greatest enemy was the heavenly Yuan Empire's army. Naturally, he had the ability to counter the Standard Formation, the Jade Crystal Formation, and other key means of battle. During the relay station period, those assault beetles and acid pterosaurs were able to forcefully break through the outer perimeter. They did not rely solely on the Hellfire Tyrant's power. It was because of Luo Nan's simulation, reference, and even direct use of the series of designs that Dumb Sand, who had yet to fully mature, was able to possess a certain level of penetration towards standard arrays, in other words, the domain of formatting. Right now, Luo Nan was indeed using stupid sand as a parameter to refine the battlefield situation on the sand table. He substituted characters like the assault beetle and the acid pterosaur. Speaking of which, even if it was a minor character like Dumb Sand, there were plenty of examples that could be used as reference. Coupled with the clear direction of artificial selection, the inheritance and optimization of the relevant configuration logic could be sped up. All sorts of favorable conditions were stacked together. Due to the limitations of the innate non-life matrix, it would take hundreds or even thousands of generations for the magical probability to take effect and form a lifelike creation like Dumb Sand. It was definitely not something that could be completed in a short hour, let alone the rapid self-evolution after taking shape. The reason why he only used the 33rd generation was because the core driving force, the most essential cheating machine, was this coarse lump of mica on the surface of the sea. Luo Nan had spent 12 hours from the wee hours of the morning until now. What he had truly spent his energy on was this similar experiment established on the water molecular matrix. Mica had already started from a higher starting point, with greater strides, and with a higher frequency. It had undergone several thousand generational changes, and only then was it able to obtain a small accomplishment. The configuration experiment of mica was undoubtedly the part that Luo Nan had spent the most effort on. However, in a certain sense, it was not as solid as Dumb Sand. Dumb Sand had a ready-made matrix configuration that could be used. Though it was not a true life matrix, it was a classic structure that had been tempered thousands of times. As for mica, Luo Nan was still learning as he used it. He was in a complete simulation state of making wild guesses. From the material plane to the life plane to the fantasy plane, there were large amounts of temporary deductions. It was constantly in turmoil and change. Its foundation was far from being stable. In any case, mica's progress was very great. The control lines on Dumb Sand's body were already quite dense. When Dumb Sand first took form, the density of the control lines cast by mica was 1,000 times higher in order to realize the interaction between the two. Practically every grain of sand had an attachment. These incorporeal ropes were used as a medium to realize the close connection and interaction between the super configurations of the two. This helped Dumb Sand to self-adjust and evolve at an abnormal speed. In this system, the dominant side was certainly mica. However, mica was far from being able to be like its ultimate reference object. Mica could not use the terrifying might of soul magnetization to control the will of higher life forms. Mica could not forcefully knead together all sorts of configurations in large quantities and give it the experience of being akin to life. The current complicated control lines were just embryonic forms. They were excessively crude embryonic forms. Of course, the next step was optimization. Luo Nan had been working on this all this time. The greatly reduced control line, meant that the optimization work was fruitful. However, as long as the optimization continued, energy consumption and computing power resources were all placed before Luo Nan's eyes. They were problems that needed to be solved. They could not be avoided. Especially the latter. Luo Nan discovered this as well. He had come into contact with the two schools of the Heavenly Yuan Empire at the relay station. He originally believed that the school of creation was extremely harsh on the rigid foundation of configuration thinking and the foundation of creation. It was extremely difficult to get started, and it was hard to get close to them. But now it seemed that the school of fantasy was a bit more flexible and open on the hard foundation of individuals. However, from practical operations, the accumulation required for this school to research and push projects was far harsher than that of the school of creation. This was because it required the accumulation of an enormous amount of information and data accumulated over the endless years. It also required high-quality models and powerful computing resources to organize and utilize these materials. It even required the spirituality and intuition of a genius. Only Luo Nan had the external neuron and its database. He also had the flood of information that was forcefully shoved into him by Sun Wheel Hell. This enormous amount of data was immeasurably large, and it catalyzed the performance of the Innerverse simulator. After experiencing a mystical dream in the simulator, all of these elements, including the memories contaminated by that damned sinful poison, went through a rough reorganization. The heavily chained crow and the wraith sign formed an imitation structure of Sun Wheel Hell. It formed a continuous resistance against the destructive power of the sinful poison contamination. In the end, it evolved into a boundless dense fog that pervaded Luo Nan's mental plane. Of course, there was also the article by the Lord of Deep Harmony. It was precisely the mystical power of the treatise, configuration, faith, and the Great Limit, a rational reconstruction of the evolution of history from ignorance to dawn, the magneto-optic mica chapter, that reconstructed a portion of the dense fog on Luo Nan's mental plane. It combined with the lamination interference technique to materialize into a grand temple. It integrated a large amount of disordered information, turning it into a concrete and precise mold that was either complete or incomplete within the temple. These things were complicated to say, but they could be described in a simple sentence. All of the above were combined together to form Luo Nan's unique information processing model. Disregarding the efficiency of this model, it seemed to be a big eater. Its capacity was astonishing, its digestive capabilities were strong, and its processing of information was quite meticulous. In the end, it could form a concrete and precise mold. It was extremely suitable for the needs of configuration design. Luo Nan could accept this information processing model. For the time being, he couldn't think of any other model that would be more suitable for him than this one. But under the current circumstances, the priority of fine processing had to give way to work speed and efficiency. The High Seas auction was about to be held. Various powers were eyeing him covetously, driven by the enormous benefits of the new plane. Even though Her Majesty Empress Wu had promised to do a good job in diplomacy for him, placing all of his hopes on someone else was not the right thing to do. Luo Nan still hoped to make solid preparations. His new plane simulation plan was a bit overly whimsical under the premise of protecting the cloud world. But if he didn't do it, who knew if he would succeed? If he didn't grit his teeth and accelerate, who knew how fast he could run in the end? And if he wanted to be fast, he needed to return to the checkpoint that he could not bypass. Energy and computing power. While Hood and the others were left speechless by Luo Nan's method of plundering resources from nothingness, Luo Nan was completely unaware that Luo Nan was having a splitting headache over how to create something from nothingness. Energy was fine. Luo Nan's core advantage had always been his soul strength resources that were rapidly expanding until they overflowed. Even though Sin Poison had dealt him a fierce blow, the basic framework was still there. If he carefully calculated, the income of the large production line would still exceed the expenditure. The most crucial thing was computing power. The processing of large amounts of information was something that defied the structure of the human brain. A few months ago, Luo Nan would probably have to go bankrupt and rent the computing space of the psychic wave network to deal with related problems. But now, he still had a path to take. More accurately speaking, he had to clean up the mess. Luo Nan gazed at dumb sand. He gazed at Mother Mica. What unfolded before his eyes was a dusky void with a deep moon and sparse stars. The vast majority of the stars were hidden behind thin clouds and mist. Only a few bright stars were distributed under the boundless curtain of the sky. Or it could be said that this was a spider web that was intermittently intertwined in the dark night. It had been torn to pieces by a certain reckless fellow. Even though it had begun to spit out silk and intertwine again, all that could be seen were a few broken lines of latitude and longitude. Luonan let out a long sigh. The living starry sky. The soul cloak. The altar spider web. And sin. Bah! That damned sin poison contamination. It had turned everything he had accumulated since his debut into ruins in an instant. More than 90% of the nodes of the large-scale brain array of cloud life forms that he had established within his sea of consciousness had instantly vanished. Even though the soul cloak had begun to gradually recover and the spider web in the living starry sky had begun to weave anew, it was still far from its peak state. Luonan had to use his brain quite a bit to clean up this mess. Chapter 984. Why was Luonan giving a live lecture? Perhaps he didn't think that much at first, but halfway through, his goal wasn't that simple anymore. On one hand, Luonan worked hard to restore the soul cloak, to reconstruct the living starry sky, to mend the altar spiderweb, and to reconnect the computing nodes that were distributed all over the world. On the other hand, his public lecture this time was tantamount to carrying out a complete update to the computing nodes of the entire world. It left behind a distinct imprint of superconfigurations and fantasy configurations in the minds of tens of thousands of ability users all over the world. Perhaps only 1 out of 1,000 would be able to learn and understand these concepts, but as long as this imprint existed, this vague train of thought existed. It was tantamount to realizing a system update, possessing the corresponding computing capabilities. The continuously restored soul cloak could stir the sea of consciousness, linking and penetrating these nodes, mobilizing the mental waves of these people. This allowed the biological brain computing array that existed within the nothingness to activate and carry out continuous deep-level deductions and calculations. Phew! Things seemed to have turned bad. It wasn't the situation. It was the hearts of people. Luonan let out a long breath, wanting to spit out those useless disturbances. But in reality, under the pressure of processing an enormous amount of information, these disturbances in his mood were just the occasional undulating wave. They suddenly faded away without a trace. Though Luonan was endlessly piling up and remodeling his computing resources, it was not enough to meet the urgent requirements. Just relying on the restoration of the biological brain computing array in the cloud was far from being able to quickly follow up. It was unknown how long it would take to forcefully push forward. Therefore, Luonan's set of 5 blocks were connected and nested with each other. The big idea of mutual reference could not be changed. Big data was like this. The initial complexity, the collection of all conditions and parameters, all for the sake of the final precision and simplification. Right now, Luonan had already done everything he could do. He could only depend on whether or not these people were willing to give it their all in the end. He confirmed the time once more. Perhaps his actions carried some sort of urging intent, but the atmosphere on the beach grew more and more solemn. Occasionally, light arcs caused by errors would shuttle through the atmosphere and cleave down. Huda sprinted among them, growing more and more urgent. His voice grew louder as he loudly berated the guardians of each block, including the frontmost one, Shinha, who had already boarded the cabin. This fellow was indeed more suited to be the captain than anyone else. The position Luonan chose for him was quite appropriate. It could be confirmed that this fellow, who was extremely rich in mental activity, was truly immersed. As for the others, whether they were driven by him or cooperated with him, they basically did their best. Under these circumstances, a bit of instability and errors were mostly problems beyond the limits of their abilities. Luonan could only consider adding a set and a half of centometers later to carry out control. There was also the blood flame order. Oh, here it comes. Luonan tilted his head and saw Meng Chong's figure appear on the jetty leading to the manor. Meng Chong walked over step by step. This #1 expert of the blood flame order's fleshly side didn't pull out a team that could compare to the burners on the beach. He was alone and walked slowly. At first glance, it was practically suspicious of his attitude. However, Luonan was able to clearly sense that there was clearly a bubbling mouth of lava that was about to leap out from the body of this person who was slowly walking over. Or perhaps it was better to say that behind this person's swaying and restless aura, there existed clearly in the region of interference between the material and the mental. It was to the extent that the surrounding air was distorted somewhat abnormally. Luonan raised his eyebrows. What he saw in this moment was not just Meng Chong. Instead, behind Meng Chong's forcefully suppressed and extremely boiling aura, Meng Chong's body was not complete, but it already possessed what Luo Nan needed. It was a deformed framework of super-explosive strength and destructive power. As for why Meng Chong was able to reach this point, Luo Nan could guess. It was most likely because the Blood Flame Order had stirred the lowest layer of the lava lake structure of the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss region with all their strength. This caused the solidified configuration of the Abyss region to become somewhat unstable. It had to be said that this was a very extreme yet ingenious idea. Was Mrs. Halder using this method to express the resolute attitude of the Order? Or was it to turn the Order into a tool on a new level? These distracting thoughts were quickly annihilated. Meng Chong's pace was slow, but it didn't take long for him to reach Luo Nan's side. He just bowed and didn't say much. He just walked forward, wanting to cross the beach region and return to his position. Luo Nan opened his mouth to stop him. Hold on. Meng Chong subconsciously stopped, but his entire body swayed a bit too much. He turned his head in astonishment, and the corner of his eyes split open. Blood spurted out, and a small portion of it instantly dried up and hardened on his face. Meng Chong was completely unaware of it. His current body temperature was certainly very high. Perhaps it exceeded 50 degrees, 60 degrees, or even higher in some areas. It had already far exceeded the physiological limits of a normal warm-blooded animal. His entire physiological system entered a state of high consumption and combustion. In a certain sense, Meng Chong was even more suitable to be called a burner than the people on the beach. Not to mention Luo Nan, even Hood, who was on the beach, discovered the abnormality. He hesitated for a moment before taking the initiative to walk back to observe. Luo Nan didn't care about Hood. He just shook his head at Meng Chong. The price is a bit too high. This capable expert was truly loyal and devoted to the Blood Flame Order, or rather to Madame Halder. This extreme method caused the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss region to become excessively turbulent. Meng Chong, who bore the framework of this turbulence, was bound to make great sacrifices. Meng Chong had a train of thought but lacked skill. The application structure was excessively crude, and the internal optimization was tantamount to nothing. All sorts of elements were gathered together to act as the final bearer. It was fortunate that Meng Chong had once passed the trial of the Blood Flame Will. He possessed a certain level of resistance toward this type of extreme power. Only then was he able to walk to Luo Nan alive. Looking at it from another angle, why was it Meng Chong? This was because of the high-level members of the Blood Flame Order in D City. The only one who could withstand the extreme power of the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss region and not die was Meng Chong. Therefore, it was still Meng Chong who came. As for whether or not Meng Chong could survive until the end of the experiment, it all depended on the will of the heavens. This was no longer a help. This was a kind of sacrifice. Meng Chong didn't need to say anything. Mrs. Halder, Yin Lu, and the others also maintained their silence. But their attitude was self-evident. This showed more weight than Yin Lu rushing to Ban City to be a personal secretary. Even Mrs. Halder's disregard for her life to attack Gong Chi was a bit lacking due to the implications of benefits. No matter how slow Luo Nan was, he still received the message. In the end, he wasn't someone with a heart of stone. When faced with this sort of situation, even though he knew that the other side was waiting for his judgment, he didn't want to just watch Meng Chong throw away his life. In this world, people like Meng Chong were about to go extinct. Hood walked over at this time. He looked at Meng Chong with amazement. Hood had crossed paths with Meng Chong 2 days ago because of that unlucky bastard Cadman. Hood knew that the fleshly body of this Blood Flame Order was a tough nut to crack. But it was strange. This bro was fine just now. He looked like he wanted to fight them. How did he turn into a human bomb that could explode at any time in the blink of an eye? This bro. If he wanted to fight against them, don't just take a deep breath. Just let out a fleshly firework. This was a live broadcast to the entire world. Luo Nan shot a glance at Hood. This fellow's rich mental activity was not detailed, but Hood was like a buzzing housefly. It was very annoying. Because Hood was an outsider, Luo Nan thought for a moment. He didn't directly tell Meng Chong things like, if you want to live, then do this and that. Instead, he told Meng Chong one thing. The aura on your body is too intense right now. If you directly go over, the beach will most likely turn into chaos. That makes sense. Hood fiercely nodded in agreement. Meng Chong slightly adjusted his aura. He turned his gaze to the side and roughly observed. He nodded slightly and spoke softly. "Then I'll go around." His voice was very low and weak, but there was an abnormal reverberation to it. It showed the unstable state of the fleshly body. Luonan didn't listen carefully. He simply interrupted. "Just fly over. I'll give you a hand." He didn't wait for Meng Chong to come back to his senses as he spoke. He simply extended a hand and pressed down on Meng Chong's shoulder. Hood's eyes went perfectly round from the side. He wanted to see how Luonan would act. At least 100 meters. Luonan spoke before he could finish his thought. "Go!" There were no sound or light effects. In fact, Luonan didn't do anything at all. It was just that the Wraith sign, who was earnestly playing the role of Sun Wheel Hell with the heavily chained crow, responded to Luonan's thoughts. Its ugly face turned, and its 6 heterochromatic pupils shot out demonic light. The light penetrated the boundary between the mental and the material to circle around Meng Chong's body. The other Blood Soul Temple, which once belonged to the sacrificial tool mold of the Blood Flame Order, was subdued within the Wraith sign's body. It instantly resonated with Meng Chong, and a ray of bloody light that was hard for others to see was cast down. It went straight for Meng Chong's head. With Luonan's control over the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District, the two sides wouldn't be in any conflict. This misty and strange power cut in like plucking a bowstring, like beating a drum. It caused Meng Chong's limbs and bones to buzz and tremble. It also caused the energy of his entire body to go out of control, and he suddenly burst forth. Meng Chong himself was still in a state of dizziness and shock. He was completely unaware that the power that had gone out of control had already spread out of his body. It formed a circle of bloody red flame light that was visible to the naked eye. The light rippled and circulated, dazzling with radiance. Even someone like Hood, who had gone through professional training, subconsciously narrowed his eyes when the intense light pierced him. The sound of the wind whistled in the blur before his eyes, and a wave of heat assaulted his face. Hudi Gang instinctively made a defensive action, but he already felt something was wrong. When he focused his eyes and looked again, Meng Chong's figure was already nowhere to be seen in the area of the sports car camp. Hood was startled. He turned his head to chase after Meng Chong, but he saw a bloody light fly down from the beach directly across from the sports car camp. It landed right in front of the exoskeleton of the deep blue walker that had stood there for a long time. In the blink of an eye, the bloody light turned solid, revealing Meng Chong's somewhat swaying figure. He stood in the position he should have been standing. However, the bloody light that expanded outwards didn't ease up just because Meng Chong had arrived at his destination. Meng Chong was still searching for the feeling of balance after flying through the air. It looked like he didn't notice at all that the bloody light of flame swayed outside of his slightly swaying body. From time to time, there would be flame tails and jets that flew outwards, forcefully twisting and curling around without dissipating. These distorted flames and the ripples in the air that were being roasted by the high temperature were like a freehand artist casually splashing ink. After a few sweeps, they seemed to draw out a malevolent silhouette of nothingness. At first glance, the lower half of the silhouette seemed to be embedded into Meng Chong's waist. The other half was roaring soundlessly under the illumination of the flames. It struggled and tore. It seemed as if it could break free from Meng Chong's body at any time and wreak havoc on the world. Chapter 985. That fellow. Hood's right eyelid twitched violently. In an instant, he felt as if he had returned to the scene of the most unbearable mission from 2 days ago. Although it was mainly a remote image at that time, separated by half the Pacific Ocean, the result of him being so close to Cadman at that time was that the smell of burning flesh and lava still lingered in front of his nose. He is allergic. Damn it, you guys really didn't try to hide it at all? Not too far away, Luonan was stroking his chin as he evaluated. It's an unexpected fit. It doesn't seem to be an influence from later on, but the effect is quite good. Hood hoped that he could understand, but he didn't dare to. In fact, he really didn't understand. He just felt that the scene had once again exceeded the scope of his expectations. There was a bit of a commotion on the beach, probably because of Meng Chong's super flashy entrance. Luonan frowned, and his gaze quickly turned over. Without further ado, Hood stood at attention again. I'll go and suppress them immediately. As he spoke, he fled as if he was fleeing from a calamity. Luonan's eyebrows didn't unlock. It wasn't just the burners on the beach that were in turmoil. In his previous lectures, he had talked a lot about the theory of superconfigurations and demonstrated experiments. This could only be considered a one-man show. For the vast majority of people, and even for some of the extraordinaries watching from the side, there was no room for them to ponder over it. All they had to do was follow his train of thought. Regardless of the format, everyone obediently watched the live broadcast. The problem was that aside from the wraith sign, the source of Luo Nan's effect on Meng Chong, it would be hard for anyone else to match up to him. A considerable portion of the other functions had already been revealed. The specific interferences between body and soul, as well as the ready-made and familiar rule framework. It was truly someone's cup of tea. Moreover, in terms of visual effects, it was full marks for stimulation. Luo Nan squinted his eyes. If the demonic outline 100 meters away were to be brightened up and give it a bit more texture, then it would be the mushed-mouth ape without a doubt. Didn't you see Hu Dedu's bitter and hateful face? The wraith sign's actions were a little deceptive. Luo Nan didn't care. It was just that the blood flame order was bound to Mr. Mo before this. It was one thing, but if they were to be directly linked to the new plane, then they would have a headache in the future. Troublesome. Luo Nan grumbled in a low voice. He wasn't talking about future troubles. Instead, he was talking about the extraordinary level probing power drifting in the periphery. It was not easy for them to discover something that was both familiar and sensitive. They were too excited, and they gathered too close to the beach, especially to Meng Chong's side, which destroyed their original tacit understanding, if there was any tacit understanding at all. Such an action had already caused substantial interference to Luo Nan's experimental progress. During the days of fierce battles at the relay station, with the sin poison keeping watch, when had there ever been any interference from the mental plane? There was also Meng Chong's side. The frequent focus of the probing power would definitely affect his already unstable state. If he was not careful, he would really become a bloody firework. Luo Nan originally wanted to make a few more adjustments to stabilize the state of all parties. But now that the situation was like this, Luo Nan didn't think about it any further. He closed his eyes and let out a long breath. At this time on the beach, Hu Digang kicked the butts of two startled fellows in the back row. He displayed his reprimand by shouting a few times. Then he turned his head to the side and stole a glance at Luo Nan's expression. Of course, there were no valuable details. But he didn't dare to relax. He raised his voice even higher. Which part? Coastal defense? You're a proper soldier, yet you have the face to mention it? The blood vessels in the forehead of a certain second lieutenant of D City's coastal defense army, who had been yelled at by Hu Digang, nearly exploded. But a mistake was a mistake. Hu Digang helped him sort it out step by step. He forcefully swallowed his temper. Actually, Hu Digang knew that this fellow had the face of a pirate, but he was still making a big fuss. This fellow even stole Hu Digang's lead before. Hu Digang was doing this on purpose. He was able to obtain a bit of pleasure from the other's reaction in order to mend his wounded heart. Hu Digang was happy. He was just about to move on to his next target when the energy structure on this side clearly became chaotic. He flew into a rage and kicked over, causing Wilson to stagger. What the hell are you doing? Wilson didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He didn't even cast his gaze at Hu Digang. Instead, he looked over Hu Digang's shoulder and cast his gaze at an area even further away. Hu Digang's heart trembled, and he suddenly turned his head. He didn't find his target on his first try. His first impression was the strongest. He thought that Meng Chong, who was at the forefront, had sent out a demonic moth. He discovered that this wasn't the case and shifted his gaze. Only then did he lock onto the correct target. Sandball. The sandball that was floating in the center of the central axis, acting as a ruler, escaped from everyone's control and control. It began to float upwards until it reached a height of around 10 meters. It was like a dim star that replaced the sun that was mostly obscured by the fog. It hung above the beach and above everyone's heads, silently rotating. All of the syncopators seemed to revolve around it as well. Of course, this also included the complicated flow of energy and information connected to it, as well as the entire structure of the formatting domain. On the beach, the burners who were directly involved felt the most. In their days, the sandball was like a deep demonic eye. It gazed down and imprinted an ice-cold pressure on everyone's hearts. The sandball didn't have any pupils, but the complicated and constantly changing patterns on its surface seemed to be able to form a similar pattern at any time, rotating and flowing. Who knew where it was facing? At this moment, no one made a sound. The entire beach was silent. As the only outsider in this area, Zhang Yingying was already having a hard time with the continuous changes. She subconsciously sucked in a breath of air, and a chill ran down her spine. The beach where her biological son was located had inexplicably become extremely unfamiliar. How could she not know that the situation had now entered a critical juncture? But what should she do next? Just as she was in a dilemma, she heard the sound of an engine. The motorboat that she had piloted to charge onto the beach had drifted back to the coastal area at some unknown time. It started inexplicably and emitted a low noise. How could she not know what was going on? She clenched her teeth and brandished her fists at her biological son, who was crawling with his head lowered. She didn't say anything more. She stepped on the seawater, flipped over, and boarded the motorboat. She sped along the coastline and circled far away. As for the live broadcast, who cared about it? Just as Zhang Yingying sped along the coastline, the gray fog on the surface of the sea seemed to receive a new wave of sea wind. It began to slowly surge upwards, and its front end nearly crushed the edge of the beach. In the next second, Meng Chong, who was standing in front of the deep blue Walker experimental machine due to the extremely eye-catching effects of the dazzling light and shadow, suddenly shrunk his swaying body. A low, hoarse roar was squeezed out of his throat. Bloody flames soared, and the incorporeal image within seemed to want to tear apart Meng Chong's spine as it struggled to jump out. Meng Chong's body made a corresponding response. It clearly swelled up by a large circle, like a cage that grew with the wind. It forcefully imprisoned the demonic image. But looking at it from another angle, who would dare say that this wasn't an even deeper fusion? The abnormal swelling and deformation of his muscles and bones caused Meng Chong to be unable to maintain his balance any longer. His body fiercely leaned forward. Since the deep blue Walker experimental machine was close at hand, he naturally extended his hand and pressed down on its ice-cold outer armor. He cut a very sorry figure. The problem was that Shi Xinhe, who had been confused by a series of obvious and obscure unforeseen events within the cockpit, nearly let out a blood-curdling shriek in this instant. The manic heat penetrated through the thin outer armor, which wasn't up to wartime standards, with a rumble. In that instant, it was as if the cockpit had been flooded by a terrifying molten iron. His body and soul felt as if they were about to turn to ashes in the blink of an eye. Shi Xinhe didn't even need to react in his brain. The deep blue platform's self-protection mechanism had already displayed its effect. The format of fire and even the format domain automatically triggered a counterattack mechanism. A dazzling white light burst forth from within and without the metal exoskeleton. Scarlet flames and white light clashed in an instant. After a short struggle, neither side was able to do anything to the other. They sank and erupted. In the blink of an eye, the area of the beach where the two stood exploded with a rumble. Light shot into the sky. The enormous amount of water vapor that Luo Nan had left behind at the front of the beach was completely annihilated the moment the two sides clashed. The powerful shockwave wouldn't slow down because of this tiny obstacle. Instead, it rapidly spread out with an even more intense momentum under the powerful pressure of the second wave of colliding forces. Holy crap! What's going on? The shockwave from the front of the beach struck over, setting off a low-intensity sandstorm. Only now did Hood, whose face was covered in sand, truly understand the meaning behind some of Luo Nan's previous words. For example, the beach will be a bit messy in a bit. For example, we absolutely can't let any shockwave enter this circle and damage the sports car. He turned his head to look at Luo Nan. Within the sandstorm that filled the sky, Luo Nan's face became exceptionally blurry. It was impossible to see what sort of calculations Luo Nan was making. I knew this bro was going to cause trouble, but this is the situation from the start. Are you sure you can control the situation in the end? Maybe you really can control it. This was because Hood saw it. Although the words on the front of the beach were annihilated in the first instance, the words were also condensed from weak water vapor. They were distributed in various areas, and the numbers on top of everyone's heads. The words were actually clear and distinct within the sandstorm raised by the shockwave. This was too much. Who didn't know why a good experiment, a live broadcast, had suddenly turned into this. Could this be the result of Luo Nan's experiment? What in the world was he trying to deduce with this sand table? Hood couldn't help but turn his head once more. Unfortunately, he was destined to be unable to substitute himself in Luo Nan's point of view. He couldn't see the truth that existed in another dimension. Luo Nan leaned against the sports car. He faced the sweeping sandstorm and narrowed his eyes. From his perspective, everything before his eyes appeared excessively simple and crude compared to his memories. Some of it even reached the point of absurdity and ridicule. But so what? Countless specious configurations joined together, collided, tore, and shattered as they struggled to reconstruct and reappear. Gradually, the appearance of his memories was restored. Before his eyes was clearly the awe-inspiring pass of the base. It was the surging and raging flames. It was the slave army that swarmed and pounced. It was the towering mountain of clouds that transcended his perception, yet it could topple down at any time. Chapter 986. When Zhang Yingying circled around the dangerous coastline, she threw away the jet ski and arrived by Luo Nan's side while gasping for breath. Zeolite Beach, the somewhat famous high-class private resort beach in T-City, had already changed beyond recognition. In the forefront region, Shi Xinhe piloted the Deep Blue Walker experimental machine and Meng Chong, who was practically burning from head to toe. Both sides were warrior types, especially Meng Chong. He could be considered a powerful fleshly expert. But right now, they didn't display any exquisite combat techniques. They just collided with each other in the most primitive way. Even so, violent energy erupted from them, shaking the beach. Sand and stones flew everywhere, blotting out the sky. And on Zhang Yingying's side, especially when she looked at the beach from Luo Nan's position, she couldn't help but have a similar feeling to a certain someone before. This was basically a chess sandbox, or a chess game. Everyone on the beach was like a chessboard. There was no subjective initiative. Luo Nan just set up the formation, and everyone occupied their positions. They tapped and moved, released a move, and calculated the ball. Luo Nan seemed to be pondering his next move. He didn't make any moves. Zhang Yingying didn't have time to think too much. She didn't come all the way here to watch the show. She had received a message from Her Majesty Empress Wu. She had come to deliver a message. The boss is afraid of disturbing you, so she told me to tell you. Most of the others are tactful. She will help you keep an eye on things. Take control of the situation yourself. Don't be too hasty. Don't let certain people lead the tempo. Certain people? Luo Nan had a general idea of the fluctuating threads of telepathy in the Abyss region, but he really didn't know the specifics. Well, some are fine, but some are restless. Halfway through her words, she stuck out her tongue. It was unknown if Her Majesty Empress Wu was warning her from afar, but she didn't continue speaking. But she couldn't hold it in for a few seconds. She still actively hinted. It's just a few of the diamond type. Diamond? Luo Nan understood quite well at first, but Zhang Yingying's words confused him. You're behind the times. Forget it. I'll talk about it later. Don't get distracted. Luo Nan didn't say anything. He just nodded slightly. It had to be said that he had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen. Compared to the time in Xia City, the heavyweight audience members were quite polite today. Or could it be that Luo Nan had basically reached the point of not being surprised by this level? Her Majesty Empress Wu's reminder was timely, and Luo Nan's control was spot on. Most importantly, the sand table, which had been continuously remodeled, and the chess pieces, which had been trained for several hours, gradually possessed the embryonic form of a three-way confrontation he needed. Luo Nan was pursuing a relatively sealed temporal structure. Once the basic form was right, the spatial distortion and sealing effect would naturally appear. It had a certain shielding effect on those curious or ill-intentioned prying eyes. Now that the cage theory was trending, forcible spying and contact on the mental level could be described as sexual harassment, which had a considerable theoretical basis. A similar thought flashed through his mind, but he quickly suppressed it. Luo Nan continued to watch the sand table in front of him. While most people were still attracted by the wrestling on the beach, They did not know that the real main body of the confrontation was the invisible domain structure on the beach and the fog on the ocean that had begun to roll and disperse. Meng Chong represented the Hellfire Tyrant type of attack power. Though it was a bit specious, it still completed the oppressive task quite well at this stage. It was like a heavy hammer, smashing the originally loose domain structure into a deformed state. It was more tenacious than before. So much so that the people on the beach finally had a bit of the posture of the bloodshed land. Luo Nan took advantage of this and used the syncopator to glue them together. He used a portion of his fantasy mimicry configuration to make them more and more in line with the basic form of a relay station in his dream. As for the mica mother constructed by the sea fog on the outside, it was undoubtedly far inferior to the true body. It was this disparity that caused the collision between the two to produce a serious deviation from the appearance in Luo Nan's memories. But it didn't matter. Only by discovering the deviation could he begin to correct it. Luo Nan actually felt that the difficulty of his current work had dropped. From his perspective, the preparatory work before was like making proofs and building models. It was like the last big question on a math exam. If he knew it, he knew it. If he didn't know it, he didn't know it. Everything had to be created from nothing. Everything had to be logically complete. And now, he finally had a basic framework to refer to. He also had a few plausible answers to choose from. It was similar to a multiple-choice question. Of course, he could save quite a bit of brain power. It didn't matter if he made a mistake for a moment. No one would deduct points. At worst, he could just start over if a piece collapsed. And this was a bit like the situation in the Misty Maze. Luo Nan was even more familiar with this sort of piecemeal puzzle work. With Luo Nan's current mobilization of computing power, his advancement speed was quite fast. He had a clearer understanding of the basic configuration and outline of the mica mother. Of course, it was impossible for him to achieve everything in one go. Luo Nan never had such extravagant hopes. He just wanted to solidify his foundation a bit more. He didn't want to do a complete simulation on a large scale. Instead, he wanted to make a true leap. He wanted to take that step from the relatively simple saturated structure of water vapor in the material plane to the living plane. Cough. He was clearly thinking too much. He didn't need to truly act on the material state. He just needed to make a false leap on the configuration plane. He was quite satisfied with Silly Sand's stable substrate simulation configuration that could withstand the test. He couldn't possibly hope to forcefully create a magnetic optic mica. With this sort of standard in mind, Luo Nan felt that he wasn't too far from achieving his goal. He had this sort of feeling. Just a bit more. Just a bit more. The leap was a kind of qualitative change. It was just a bit more. Perhaps it would require a much greater accumulation than before. It was even possible that he would have to start over from scratch. But Luo Nan had an intense premonition. It was an intuition built upon the foundation of a solid configuration design. Perhaps this was where the spirituality of the school of fantasy lay. The direction shouldn't be wrong. It was just a bit more. Then he had to do his work a bit more solidly. Zhang Yingying narrowed her eyes to the side. She half covered her forehead with her palm, blocking the violent whirlwind and sand that assaulted her face. She did her best to lock onto the position of her son, but she couldn't help but worry. The only thing that made her feel at ease was that the chess pieces on the sand table, aside from the two at the very front, were all obediently staying in the background. They wouldn't step on silly sand at all. But she didn't know what would happen next. Zhang Yingying turned her head, wanting to ask a question, but she forcefully restrained herself for fear of causing a disturbance. The current Luo Nan felt like a focused conductor. He flicked his fingers and swung his arms in the air of nothingness. His movements weren't large, but he was very restrained and very calm. But he was much more invested than his previous attitude of watching with cold eyes. She couldn't see any corresponding changes on the sand table, but Zhang Yingying furrowed her brows and raised her head to look at the sky. The sky was overcast. The sun had been able to barely pierce through the layer of mist and clouds, showing off some of its existence. But after the whirlwind of sand and pebbles, the sun was completely hidden behind the layer of clouds. Actually, the boundaries of the cloud layer were nearly impossible to see. There was only a gloomy, leaden expanse. Zhang Yingying could still feel that the humidity of the atmosphere had clearly increased. The air pressure was dropping as well. This should be a process of continuous development. It was just that it had been suppressed by the momentum of the sweeping sandstorm earlier. It was only now that it was barely manifested. And these weren't the main points. Zhang Yingying discovered that the most crucial factor in this series of changes was thunder? She muttered. She wasn't too sure because the vibrations in the atmosphere were far too weak. Perhaps it was just a misconception. Oh, a misconception. F***CK. Zhang Yingying jumped in fright. She never thought that Luo Nan would be able to hear her muttering to herself at this time. Luo Nan chatted with her. Don't get distracted. It's fine. I'm quite focused. Also, there are times when the atmosphere is very fragile. Huh. Luo Nan laughed and continued with his previous actions. It looked like he really was quite relaxed. A few seconds later, he even pursed his lips and began to whistle. He clearly didn't have much technique. His whistle was a bit hoarse at first, but his extraordinary control over his fleshly body helped him quickly find the right path. The whistle grew clearer and clearer. Later on, it struck together with the surging sandstorm, causing it to be particularly intense. It was quite fitting for the current situation on the beach. But later on, the gradually lengthened and turned low. It seemed to be a bit spacious and desolate. This bro's mood. Ha! Zhang Yingying didn't know what to use to describe it for a time. When he whistled, his mind should be relaxed and his mood good. But she just couldn't experience a similar feeling. The melody isn't bad. What song is it? A new song composed by Sister Moya? Zhang Yingying quietly used the ability to recognize songs by listening, but she didn't gain anything. Whatever. Luo Nan also paused to reply. He didn't even know how he had hummed. He had whistled out. Yes, it was Wei Suyi's song, Scarlet Wheel. Clearly, he had been infected by Liang Lu. Liang Lu was focused on her work. She would do this when she was in a good mood. Luo Nan didn't really like it at first. From his perspective, the concert would draw other thoughts and disturb his normal work. But Liang Lu spoke eloquently. She said that the School of Creation was most proficient in precise planning. She divided the brain. She needed a buffer or a metronome to effectively plan the pace of the task. In any case, she had ample theoretical support. Luo Nan didn't comment at the time, but now he suddenly felt. Not bad. He searched for the feeling, pursed his lips and whistled. It was the song that he didn't quite understand the meaning of. Amidst this ear-scratching yet unfamiliar tune, he seemed to have returned to the relay station in his days. He was at his own workstation, in that sealed yet unexpectedly fulfilling environment. He faced countless broken machines, and he was next to interesting and reliable comrades. He made the incomplete become whole, and he made the damaged reconstruct and renovate. Everything was very familiar. It flowed smoothly, and it wasn't dull. It was as if he could work endlessly until the entire base was full of vitality and operation. Well, there weren't such workstations in reality. There was such a base. Even comrades seemed to be nothing more than refactoring code in the void. But right now, there were indeed innumerable incorporeal structures before Luo Nan's eyes. They slowly shifted and changed. They worked in harmony, causing a marvelous force to faintly give birth. Even though there were many discords within, the incorporeal structures rubbed against each other, shaking and vibrating until the cacophony was jumbled and the dark hummed. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.